After leaving my job, I got pregnant with my former boss's child. As the CEO's chief secretary, Wei Yan has always been conscientious and hardworking, known as a role model in the industry. However, she accidentally got pregnant with her boss's child. In order to protect her baby, she deliberately made trouble and finally let the cold-blooded devil kick her. Just when she was running away with the baby, the devil came to his senses and arrested her again. Chapter 1, She has a huge secret. The sky began to lighten with a faint white glow, and the lingering intimacy in the bedroom gradually faded. The man's gaze slid over the woman's smooth back, and then, without a hint of reluctance, he pulled away and entered the bathroom. He quickly changed into a silver-gray suit and, with a neutral expression, walked out the door. At this moment, his cold and indifferent appearance was a stark contrast to the man he had been last night, when it seemed like he would have killed her on the spot if he could. Of course, even last night, immersed in desire, his expression wasn't exactly full of passion. The moment he got up, Wei Yan had already woken up but had pretended to still be asleep. Her throat felt a bit dry and hoarse. Just as he was about to step out of the room, she quietly said, "President Ling, goodbye." Ling Yeting didn't seem to react to her words, his footsteps only slightly pausing before continuing down the stairs. His cold attitude made Wei Yan smirk faintly. For years ago, she had joined Ling's company as an intern. On her first day, she accompanied Ling Yeting to a social event, where he was plotted against, and she ended up being the one to help him sober up. The rest of the story was cliché and unremarkable. The relationship between the CEO and his chief secretary had lasted until today. Although Ling Yeting never said a word, Wei Yan knew that they probably wouldn't have any more chances to meet. She quickly got up, packed her things, and went downstairs, where, as expected, she found Ling Yeting's assistant, Song Ji, sitting on the sofa in the living room. Song Ji sat upright, wearing a pair of gold-framed glasses, with a laptop on his lap, his fingers typing rapidly, his expression serious and focused. He heard the sound and turned to look at her, pushing up his glasses. His eyes fell on the suitcase she was carrying, and his gaze deepened for a moment before he quickly hid the surprise in his eyes. The two had worked together for many years and cooperated quite well professionally. Wei Yan naturally greeted him and sat down opposite him. Songji then moved his laptop aside and handed her a set of documents he had already prepared. He cleared his throat and said, "Secretary Wei, these are from President Ling." Wei Yan took the documents and glanced at them, but remained silent for a long time. Her eyelashes fluttered slightly, giving her a somewhat fragile appearance. Songji thought she was upset and said softly, "Secretary Wei, if you need anything else, feel free to ask. As long as it's not too much, with the relationship you two have, President Ling will surely fulfill your request." Relationship. To Ling Yeting, she was nothing but an outlet for his desires. For a tool, there might be some nostalgia, but once it's no longer needed, it will be discarded. Speaking of relationship, it seemed that he was overestimating her place in Ling Yeting's life. Wei Yan snapped out of her thoughts and gave a faint smile, saying, "President Ling is really generous." Her tone was somewhat indifferent, which made Song Ji inwardly click his tongue. Wei Yan seemed to be completely calm, as if she had already expected that Ling Yeting would end things. Having been with him for 4 years, now that it was ending, Ling Yeting had given her 3 properties, including the villa they were in, along with cash and other items that totaled at least 100 million. Not to mention the things she had received over the years. Even if she married someone else now, this money would be enough to ensure she'd live comfortably for the rest of her life. Wei Yan was truly a tough character. Even when Song Ji saw the priceless breakup gift from Ling Yeting, he felt a pang of jealousy. Most women would be overjoyed and jump up at receiving such a gift, but Wei Yan showed no emotion at all. She even managed to subtly criticize Ling Yeting. Wei Yan quickly signed the documents. Then she took out her prepared resignation letter from her bag and handed it to Song Ji, politely saying, "Sorry to trouble you, Assistant Song." Song Ji understood. Given her position, it was only natural that she would leave Ling Yeting and resign from Ling's company. He accepted everything and said, "Secretary Wei, no need for formalities." Wei Yan then smiled faintly. "I'm no longer Secretary Wei. Just call me Wei Yan." Song Ji quickly stood up and left. Wei Yan watched his retreating figure and gently placed her hand on her still flat stomach. Ling Yeting had lost interest in her, and she needed to find a way to break free. She was hiding a huge secret, and she couldn't let him find out. Chapter 2, Find a way to make him lose interest. Song Ji packed up the documents and returned to the car. Leng Yeting was leaning against the back seat, eyes closed, resting. His expression was far from pleasant. Hearing the movement, he lazily glanced at him. Song Ji understood and immediately reported, "I've already spoken to Wei Yan." Leng Yeting raised an eyebrow. "Wei Yan?" "Ahem." Song Ji handed him Wei Yang's resignation letter. "This is Secretary Wei's resignation letter." Leng Yeting opened it, looking at the carefully written yet extremely formulaic content. The corners of his lips curved slightly, a mocking smile playing on his face. The car was silent for a few seconds before he spoke. What was her reaction? Song Ji didn't dare to hide anything but felt that Wei Yang's reaction didn't meet Leng Yeting's expectations, so he replied, "President Leng's arrangement was something she had to accept. Secretary Wei is always tactful, and she even complimented you for being generous." Leng Yeting didn't respond. Song Ji watched his expression, sensing that his mood wasn't the best. However, the next moment, Leng Yeting crumpled the neat resignation letter and casually tossed it into the car's small trash bin. He closed his eyes again, his tone indifferent, emotionless as he said, "Drive." Song Ji had been with Leng's company longer than Wei Yang had. He had been there when Leng Yeting and Wei Yan first met. At that time, he didn't think there was anything special between them. But the boss was always hard to read, and in a blink, Leng Yeting had brought her to his bed. Everyone assumed it was just a fling, but to everyone's surprise, Leng Yeting wasn't just playing around. He appeared to be cold-hearted but, unexpectedly, he had been with the same mistress for 4 years. During this time, Leng Yeting practically spent every night in Wei Yang's bed. Even Song Ji couldn't help but privately wonder if Wei Yang might eventually marry into the Leng family. But suddenly, he received a notice from Leng Yeting, asking him to deal with Wei Yan. Deal with her. It was as if she were an old rag being tossed aside. Wei Yang didn't stay at the villa for long. After finishing everything, she noticed the time for her appointment was approaching. She shoved her suitcase into the trunk and drove straight to the hospital. Her best friend, Yao Yao, worked as a doctor in the obstetrics and gynecology department at the Central City Hospital. Wei Yan went straight to her office. Yao Yao, with a slightly babyish face, completed her routine checkup and, after a while, her expression softened as she looked at the report and said, "Don't worry, my godson is perfectly healthy." Wei Yang had felt a little anxious, but now a genuine smile appeared on her face. "How do you know it's not a goddaughter?" "I like girls." "I like goddaughters too." Yao Yao smiled as she handed her the report. Wei Yang had an interest in medicine and had read many medical books, so she could understand the report herself. If it weren't for the lack of money in her family and the late income stability in the medical field, she might have been a doctor like Yao Yao by now. Yao Yao couldn't help but remind her, although the baby is strong, you still need to be careful. Too much intensity in that area could cause problems. Wei Yang's gaze still lingered on the report, but the smile on her face faded slightly. "Don't worry, it won't happen again. Leng Yeting is tired of me, gave me a large sum of money, and from today onwards, I'm a free woman." The baby in her womb was already over a month old. She had never expected to find herself in an unplanned pregnancy, but it had happened. When she was a child, she had fallen into water, injuring her reproductive system and leaving her with severe cold in the uterus. If this baby were to be lost, she might never be able to get pregnant again. Wei Yang had wondered if Leng Yeting had been so clingy recently because he had developed some genuine feelings for her. But soon, she figured it out. Leng Yeting was just tired of her. He likely thought of it as using something until it was no longer useful, and then tossing it aside after a few more uses to avoid a loss. And Leng Yeting would never allow her to have his child. Even if he wasn't tired of her, she would find a way to make him lose interest. Chapter 3, He Drunk. Wei Yang had already made a plan. She sold off the real estate and everything Leng Yeting had given her over the years that could be sold. Once everything was taken care of, she would take the money and return to her hometown to wait for the baby. She wouldn't come back here in this lifetime. Her goodbye this morning was, in fact, a goodbye forever. Anqing was Leng Yeting's territory. Even if she left Leng's company, there was no guarantee he wouldn't find out that she secretly had his child. She didn't doubt that the Leng family would do anything to claim the child as their own. So, she couldn't stay in this city. For now, she was temporarily staying at a hotel. She hadn't rested much the night before, so as soon as she entered the hotel, she began to catch up on sleep. She slept straight through until the evening, only waking up when the phone rang. Wei Yan didn't check the caller ID and answered directly. As soon as she heard the male voice on the other end, she instantly became alert. She was slightly confused. Assistant Song. Song Ji felt awkward as well. He had just arranged for Wei Yang to be handled this morning, and now he had to call her back. He couldn't figure out what Ling Yeting was thinking. It was typical of him to be unpredictable, but this wasn't something he'd seen him do before. At this moment, Ling Yeting was drunk, his brow furrowed in agitation, his eyes tightly closed as he impatiently tugged at his tie. Song Ji knew that Ling Yeting wasn't completely drunk, but he had been looking for faults earlier. Now, hearing that he was calling Wei Yang, and without stopping him, it was obvious that he had allowed it. Song Ji had no choice but to muster up the courage and tell Wei Yang, Secretary Wei, President Ling is drunk. Please come to the usual place to pick him up. Wei Yan quickly realized what was happening. She couldn't help but let out a mocking smile. He said he was done with her, but never even spoke to her face to face. He just sent an assistant to deal with her. Wei Yang had a good temper, but that didn't mean she had no temper at all. She lazily curled up in her bed and responded politely, Assistant Song, you've dialed the wrong number. I've already resigned. The secretary department has many capable people ready to assist at any time. You should contact someone else. With that, she hung up the phone. Song Ji listened to the busy signal, then turned to look at Ling Yeting. By now, Ling Yeting had opened his eyes. His dark, deep gaze locked onto Song Ji's phone with a cold, sharp look. Song Ji wasn't far from him, and the beeping sound from the phone was clearly audible. Since joining Ling Yeting, Wei Yang had never lost her temper. She always handled things with grace, anticipating his needs without ever mentioning them. No matter what he said or did, even his occasional playful behavior in bed, she always complied wholeheartedly. This person who seemed to never get upset, to the point where she almost seemed a bit dull and robotic, had just hung up on Song Ji's call. Ling Yeting's expression darkened instantly, and he said with a mysterious tone, Got some guts, huh? Song Ji hesitated and tested the waters. Should I call another secretary for you? Ling Yeting shot him an impatient look. Song Ji immediately understood what he meant. The employees in the secretary department of Ling's company were famous for both their exceptional work abilities and their striking appearances. Since Wei Yang had been with Ling Yeting, many outsiders had subconsciously assumed that the secretary department was Ling Yeting's harem. In reality, however, Ling Yeting never touched any other woman. After Wei Yang hung up on Song Ji, she thought for a moment and then took out her phone again. She called Sumai, another chief secretary from the reserve team who lived nearby, to notify her to come. Sumai had helped her a few times during her years at Ling's company. Although they were colleagues and couldn't be close friends, she could repay her kindness appropriately. Sumai answered the phone and understood the unspoken meaning in Wei Yang's words. She quickly dressed up and went over with great enthusiasm. Sumai was nearby, and within a few minutes, she arrived at the designated box. Following the room number Wei Yang had given, Sumai knocked on the door. Song Ji was slightly taken aback when he saw her, but Sumai didn't notice him. Her gaze was completely drawn to Ling Yeting. The room was dimly lit, and Ling Yeting's face wasn't clear, but his sharply defined profile was so perfect that it could make any woman fall for him. His tie was carelessly tugged loose, and a few buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing his collarbone. In the flickering light, his raw, masculine appeal was almost overwhelming, radiating an indescribable sexiness. Sumai instinctively swallowed and cautiously approached. President Ling, Secretary Wei said you were drunk and asked me to bring you back. Ling Yeting's gaze was as cold as ice, his voice sharp. Secretary Wei sent you. Chapter 4, Midnight Visit. Sumai nodded subconsciously. Ling Yeting raised his lips slightly. Go away. Sumai. Song Ji was holding his forehead with his hand. Ling Yeting and Wei Yan, they are really two difficult ancestors, each one is more difficult to deal with than the other. The fire here hasn't been put out yet, but Wei Yang over there is adding fuel to the fire. It's difficult. Sumai stood by and shivered, looking at Song Ji for help. Song Ji was speechless and said, Are you Boss Ling's secretary, or Secretary Wei's secretary? You do whatever she tells you to do. Go back. Sumai felt secretly aggrieved. Although she was reluctant to give up this opportunity, she left immediately in order to keep her job. Song Ji looked at Ling Yeting carefully and said, "Boss Ling, let me take you back." Ling Yeting didn't even look at him this time. Wei Yan was woken up by Song Ji's call. He was no longer sleepy, so he simply got up and asked the hotel to send him a midnight snack. Recently she started to feel hungry more frequently, but couldn't eat much each time. She has been with Ling Yeting for all these years, and apart from other things, she has met many different kinds of people. In the morning, she contacted the agent directly and listed her house, car and some brand name bags as second-hand properties because the prices were much lower than the market price. The agent contacted her just now and said that many of them had already been sold. The villa where she usually lives with Ling Yeting has a potential customer, and the agent has asked her to go for a meeting tomorrow. Wei Yan was eating noodles while replying to the agent's message when there was a sudden knock on the door. Wei Yan was puzzled. "It's done so quickly." "I'm coming." She got up and opened the door, but there was no one at the door. Wei Yan frowned and was about to close the door when a hand suddenly reached out from the side, grabbed her wrist and pulled hard. "R!" Wei Yan was caught off guard and was dragged out. With a scream, he was pulled into the man's arms. She looked up in panic, but only saw the familiar jaw of the man, and her nose was filled with the familiar cold fragrance that belonged only to men. The next second, she was carried into the house. The man closed the door with his backhand, and she was pressed against it. Her lips were roughly blocked, and a kiss with the smell of alcohol was forced down her spine. Next second. Bang! The man's movements stopped instantly. He lowered his eyes and looked at her, his eyes unclear. But the coldness in his eyes seemed to freeze her into ice. Wei Yan was both scared and angry. It's not surprising that he had the ability to find this place. But Wei Yan didn't expect him to come. Her body was tense as she confronted him silently. "Boss Ling, breaking into a single woman's room in the middle of the night and forcefully kissing her is not what a gentleman does." Ling Yeting looked down at her, not missing any subtle expression on her face. After a long while, he asked curiously, "Are you angry?" Wei Yang had been with him for 4 years, and she was angry only a few times. It does give people a sense of freshness. Any woman who is kissed by a stranger should be angry. Wei Yang suppressed her emotions, pursed her lips, and said lightly, "Boss Ling, I have signed according to your wishes. You are a businessman and you should know the importance of keeping your promises. A stranger who is in close contact with you in bed every day." Ling Yeting pinched Wei Yang's chin and said, "I didn't realize before that Secretary Wei is quite sharp-tongued." Wei Yang smiled and said, "Sorry, I'm a hedgehog. Being sharp-tongued is just an instinct when facing danger." Ling Yeting narrowed his eyes slightly, and then said, "After signing, I immediately threw out my resignation letter and sold the real estate. After going through the whole process, it seems that I am the one who was planned to be kicked out by Secretary Wei." It turned out that he knew about her selling the house. She didn't expect that he would still pay attention to these things. Wei Yang knew that Ling Yeting never looked back and always carried out his decisions thoroughly. He might not really want to sleep with her again, but he probably felt embarrassed that she didn't cling to him. Wei Yang rarely saw him getting upset because of her, so she smiled self-deprecatingly. "Boss Ling, you don't have to feel embarrassed. No matter what the process was, the result is that I was the one you threw away." Wei Yang pinched her fingertips and her body became extremely tense. She lowered her eyes and stopped looking at Ling Yeting, her tone becoming even colder. "It's been 4 years. Mr. Ling is tired of me, and I am tired of him too. Mr. Ling is a good person, but people always like novelty. No matter how good it is, they will get tired of it. I'm not young anymore. Isn't it normal to sell these things and go home to get married?" Chapter 5. He has a serious illness. Just like, isn't the reason why he is drawing a line between himself and her now because he is about to marry into the Mu family, one of the 4 major families. They each have their own path to take. Ling Yeting didn't expect to hear her say that, and raised his eyebrows slightly. Get married? In his mind, it seemed that he had never thought that she would marry someone else. Even if she wasn't with him, he couldn't imagine her being with another man. Wei Yang had never thought of marrying with a child, but in order to make him believe it, she nodded, "Of course." Ling Yeting's heartless lips slightly pursed. The emotions hidden in his deep eyes seemed to be mixed with ice, freezing her whole body. She could feel that Ling Yeting was angry, but the angrier he was, the less clear his expression became. I only heard him say with a playful tone, "I didn't expect that Secretary Wei had already arranged a way out for himself." This is all thanks to Mr. Ling's training, who taught me to develop the habit of making Plan B. Wei Yan looked up at him and smiled. Mr. Ling, this is not like what you do. You came to harass me in the middle of the night after we broke up. I must have misunderstood that you fell in love with me. Ling Yeting sneered. You are quite bold in thinking. He didn't even look at her again and just turned and left. Silence returned to their house. Wei Yang's face turned pale and he felt weak all over. He slid down the door and sat on the ground. My back is covered in cold sweat. She didn't sit there for too long before she had only one thought in her mind. To avoid any more trouble, she couldn't stay in Anqing any longer. Wei Yang immediately found his cell phone, bought the earliest high-speed rail ticket for the next day, and then began to pack up and prepare to leave. I had just packed half of the things when my cell phone rang. When she heard the ringing sound, her heart skipped a beat and she had a bad feeling. Wei Yang frowned and took the phone. When he saw Songji's name on it, he began to regret not blocking all the contact information of everyone related to Ling Yeting earlier. She frowned and answered the phone, and Songji spoke in a stern tone on the other end. Secretary Wei, Secretary Su was originally going to take over your job, but she was injured in a car accident last night and cannot come to work normally. You need to return to the company temporarily to continue working until she recovers and is discharged from the hospital and can return to the company to take over. Wei Yang's chest was filled with anger, and he was shaking slightly. He gritted his teeth and said, there are so many capable people in the secretariat, anyone can take over. Songji continued, not everyone can be the chief secretary of our Ling family. Wei Yang was so angry that he dug his nails into his palms. He struggled desperately, but I have already resigned. Songji said calmly, Secretary Wei, Mr. Ling hasn't approved your resignation letter yet, so it doesn't count. You are still an employee of Ling's. If you skip work and cause major losses to the company has reason to sue you. Check WeChat. WeChat suddenly received a message. Wei Yan clicked on WeChat and saw that Songji had sent him a few contract terms. Ling's contracts have always been strict, but fair, and will not be used to embarrass employees. Wei Yan also remembered these clauses, but she never thought that Ling Yeting would use them on himself. Whether the damage caused is serious or not is not up to Ling Yeting to decide. The cold words of the contract contained silent threats and warnings. Ling Yeting clearly wanted to make trouble for her. Wei Yang's fingers, which were holding the phone, turned slightly pale, and he did not speak for a long time. Songji also felt a little bit reluctant, and finally sighed and said, Secretary Wei, President Ling is just angry right now, you can coax him, maybe he will calm down. You have to go to work tomorrow, so go to bed early. Wei Yang looked at the things she had half-packed, which looked like a joke in their haste and disorder. Chapter 6, Falling from Favor. I didn't sleep that night. She called Sumai, and Sumai hesitated on the phone. Wei Yang then knew that the car accident was fake and Ling Yeting was really angry. Wei Yang felt that Ling Yeting didn't really want her to continue working. Maybe he wanted her to go away, but she cooperated too much and went away too smoothly. He also felt that he didn't feel satisfied enough until she hugged his thighs and cried and made a fuss. She was not in a very good mood and was afraid that putting on makeup would be bad for the baby, so she simply went to the company without makeup. After all, she is someone who follows Ling Yeting, and everyone in the company knows her. She usually wears delicate makeup and high heels, but now seeing her wearing simple and plain clothes and coming to the company without makeup, I couldn't help but take a few more glances at her. I felt that she had a more fragile beauty. She is worthy of being the woman that Ling Yeting has slept with for 4 years. She is so beautiful even without makeup. After entering the company, Wei Yang took a look at Ling Yeting's work schedule and arranged everything in an orderly manner. Ling Yeting arrived late, just in time for the meeting, and his whole body was filled with a terrifying low pressure. She was waiting behind the door of the conference room. Ling Yeting didn't even look at her and walked straight into the conference room. The meeting lasted a long time. Wei Yang felt hungry in the middle, so he went to the tea room to eat some bread before returning to the meeting room. After finally waiting for the meeting to end, Ling Yeting stood up and left. When he walked to her side, his eyes suddenly became even colder. His eyes fell on her, and his tone was serious and cold. Secretary Wei, are you relying on your long experience in the company to ignore the dress code requirements of the company's secretarial department? Ling's secretariat is considered one of the faces of the company. Each person has tens of thousands of dollars in clothing expenses each year, and the requirements for everyone's dress are very high. The people around were too afraid to make a sound. Everyone was wondering, has Secretary Wei angered President Ling for the first time? Wei Yan pursed her lips, lowered her head and said nothing, allowing others to humiliate her. Even if she is very good at dealing with people, she still has conflicts of interest. Her, the chief secretary, has fallen out of favor, and many people are waiting to see the drama. Ling Yeting snorted coldly and turned back to the office. Wei Yan followed him slowly, and waited for him to talk with the company executives for an hour or two before going in and bringing him a cup of coffee. Ling Yeting also went to bed late the night before. After a busy day, his face looked a little tired. When Wei Yan brought the coffee, he was resting in his office chair with his eyes slightly closed. Putting down the coffee, Wei Yan placed his fingers on his temple, pressing it gently. For several minutes, neither of them spoke as she concentrated on relaxing him. She didn't stop until the wrinkles on Ling Yeting's brows smoothed out. She just stood aside, looking like she wanted to say something but hesitated. Ling Yeting glanced sideways and saw Wei Yan standing with his eyelashes slightly drooping and his face slightly tilted. From his angle, she looked a little fragile, as if she had been bullied. He really wanted to bully her. She seldom appears without makeup. He suddenly remembered the day she joined the company. She was ignorant and came to the company without makeup, with the simplicity and innocence of a newcomer to society on her face. Now, 4 years have passed, and she is still without makeup, but this face has learned to hide her true emotions. Ling Yeting pulled her over, his fingers wandering over her face, his tone cold. What do you want to say? Wei Yan sat obediently on his lap. Boss Ling, I was frightened last night and had a bad attitude. I apologize. With my status, it is already a great blessing to be able to stay by your side for 4 years. I dare not think about anything else. If you think my attitude is bad, you can teach me a lesson. She raised her eyes to look at him, her eyes soft. I hope you will consider that I have been with you for 4 years and not make a fuss about it. Just let me go after this. As a child of destiny, he is used to having a strong personality and will not tolerate being disobeyed. Wei Yan tried to be as humble as possible. She was also determined to let him sleep if he felt he was not having enough fun. It's him anyway, it doesn't matter if it happens once or 100 times. As long as she could be let go, she would accept it. However, after hearing her words, Ling Yeting's originally happy expression suddenly became extremely ugly. His eyes were extremely sinister and cold, and the originally harmonious atmosphere was instantly broken. Ling Yeting pushed her away from him. Wei Yan fell directly to the ground. Looking at the woman's surprised eyes, Ling Yeting said coldly, "You think highly of your own attractiveness." Wei Yan couldn't help but clench his fists. This bastard. She knew that Ling Yeting was a very petty man, but she didn't expect him to be so annoying even in such matters. Wei Yan looked up at him, a bit desperate. What do you want? It was he who wanted to get rid of her, and now he is the one causing trouble. Chapter 7, Forced to Socialize. Ling Yeting did not answer, but said with a cold look, "Get out." Wei Yan was a little discouraged. It was finally time to get off work and Wei Yan packed up and prepared to leave. The agent just contacted her and there was a house with a buyer who was very satisfied with it. They agreed to go for a face-to-face interview and sign the contract after get off work. As a result, just as she packed her things, Songji walked out of the office and went straight to her desk. Wei Yan looked at him numbly, and before he could speak, she said, "I have something to do." Songji pretended not to hear and continued, "Secretary Wei, President Ling has an appointment and wants you to go with him." As he spoke, he lowered his voice and said in a voice that only she could hear, "Secretary Wei, you'd better, don't go against him." Wei Yan laughed at himself, saying bitterly, "How can I be that capable? Ling Yeting crushed her to death as easily as crushing an ant. How dare she?" Wei Yan picked up her bag and went downstairs. On their way, she sent a message to the agent, asking him to have the buyer sign the contract first and leave the information, and she would go over to sign later. When we arrived at the parking lot, Ling Yeting was already in the car. When he saw her get into the car, his eyes were cold and indifferent. Wei Yan was in no mood to curry favor with him, so he just sat in the car by himself. Songji, who was driving, felt that the air pressure in the car was a little low, and he remained silent without saying a word. When they arrived, Wei Yan followed Ling Yeting to the box. Her heart sank when she saw her partner. This partner is nearly 50 years old, his surname is Ding, his company is very big, but his character is not very good, and he is well known for his love of women. The last time we discussed cooperation, he kept looking at her with lustful eyes. However, because she was Ling Yeting's woman, she didn't dare to do anything. And now? Ling Yeting knew what the other person's eyes meant, but he still brought her here. Wei Yan felt a chill in his heart. Those present are all smart people. When the man surnamed Ding saw Wei Yan, his eyes lit up. After greeting Ling Yeting, he stared at Wei Yan. "Secretary Wei, we meet again." Wei Yan's face was flawless, and he smiled politely yet distantly. "Hello, Mr. Ding." She wanted to walk over and sit next to Ling Yeting, but with a gesture from Mr. Ding, another woman had already taken her seat. Ling Yeting simply took the hot towel that the woman handed over to him and wiped his hands with extremely graceful movements, as if he was unaware of the undercurrents surging here. His tacit attitude made Mr. Ding even bolder. President Ding grabbed Wei Yang's wrist and smiled warmly and ambiguously. "Come on, Secretary Wei, sit next to me. Don't cling to President Ling. Don't you see that President Ling already has someone to accompany him? Don't be a light bulb." Ling Yeting glanced at her with a smile. With her status, she couldn't afford to offend any of the people present. Wei Yang had no choice but to sit down next to Mr. Ding, but he couldn't help feeling a little anxious. Just as he was feeling worried, Wei Yang felt someone suddenly touch his legs under the table. She raised her eyes and saw President Ding smiling at her. His movements under the table were even bolder. He even stretched out a hand, placed it on her leg, and tried to reach under her. "Mr. Ding." Wei Yang felt numb all over and quickly called out to him. President Ding smiled. "Secretary Wei, what's wrong?" The people at the table were joking among themselves, as if they didn't notice what was happening here. Wei Yang felt desperate, so she stepped aside, avoiding his hand calmly, and then took the initiative to say, "This is a toast to you." Mr. Ding took his hand out from under the table, picked up the wine glass, and gave her a meaningful look. His hand didn't move down further, but he just kept pouring glass after glass of wine into her mouth. Wei Yang has improved her alcohol tolerance over the years, but her physical condition is different after pregnancy, and she was drunk to the point of feeling weak all over and a little dizzy. She thought she was drunk, but she gradually felt her body getting slightly warm, and even had a familiar strange feeling in her lower abdomen. Chapter 8. I can't guarantee your end. Wei Yan frowned. Mr. Ding was really shady. He drugged her without anyone noticing. President Ding was standing by and looking at the beads of sweat on her forehead and her flushed cheeks. He was so hooked that he wanted to have sex with her right there and then. But he looked at Ling Yeting carefully. Ling Yeting was known for his unpredictable temper. He just didn't dare. He just reached out to pull Wei Yan. "Secretary Wei, I see you don't look well, are you drunk? I'll take you out for some fresh air." Wei Yang struggled hard. "Boss Ding, I can just go to the bathroom and wash my face, you guys can eat slowly." She stood up and wanted to leave, but Mr. Ding quickly came up to her. Wei Yang felt exhausted and was dragged out by him. She looked at Ling Yeting helplessly, hoping that he could save her. However, Ling Yeting tilted his head slightly, as if listening carefully to the words of the woman next to him. Wei Yang's heart suddenly sank to the bottom. She didn't expect that after following Ling Yeting for 4 years, when they were about to separate, Ling Yeting would treat her like this. Perhaps in his eyes, she was just sleeping with people for money, and since it could bring him benefits, why not do it? Her eyes were a little hot, and she was dragged out of the box by President Ding. Seeing her looking at Ling Yeting, President Ding said beside her, "Secretary Wei, stop looking. President Ling won't care about you. The business that President Ling and I are discussing is worth tens of billions. Can you compare?" President Ding reached out his hand to wipe Wei Yang's tears, but Wei Yang slightly turned her face away. President Ding continued, "Little darling, don't cry. I'm so heartbroken when you cry like this. Although I'm not as good looking as President Ling, I will love you. You might feel more comfortable following me than following President Ling." When he said the word comfortable, his tone was extremely vulgar. Wei Yang tried to stand still, wiped her tears, and forced a smile. "Boss Ding, do you have a room here? I don't like being outside." President Ding didn't expect Wei Yang to agree to it so easily. He was immediately overjoyed. "Yes, yes, yes. Of course. Let's go upstairs and rest." Wei Yang was dragged upstairs obediently by him. As soon as he entered the room, President Ding couldn't wait to drag Wei Yang to the bed. Wei Yang turned his body to the side, then raised his hand and pinched Mr. Ding's arm. Before Mr. Ding could react to her action, he suddenly felt his hand go numb and he couldn't lift it up in an instant. His expression instantly turned ugly. "Bitch, my hand. What did you do?" At this moment, Wei Yan was extremely glad that he loved studying medicine. She knows exactly where the numbness is in a person. If she fought with Ling Yeting, she would instantly become cannon fodder. But Mr. Ding looks like he has kidney deficiency, so although he may not be able to win in terms of strength, his cleverness, maybe he still has a chance to compete. Wei Yang broke free from his control, took 2 steps back, and looked at him coldly. She knew that this matter could not be resolved peacefully. "Playing tricks on me? I'll kill you later." Mr. Ding gritted his teeth, looked at her hatefully, and rushed forward to slap her while enduring the pain in his hands. Wei Yang didn't dodge. When his hand fell on her face, she hugged his arms with both hands and then exerted a little force. Using some clever strength, he pushed it hard. Click! A crisp sound. Suddenly, Mr. Ding's screams like a pig being slaughtered were heard in the room. Wei Yang felt exhausted and took several steps back, looking at him defensively. "Boss Ding, I advise you not to move, otherwise I can't guarantee what will happen to you." Mr. Ding felt as if his hand had been broken by her and he could not use any strength at all. He gnashed his teeth in hatred. However, at this moment, he didn't dare to really compete with Wei Yang. After playing with women for so many years, this was the first time he suffered such a big loss. President Ding's expression was extremely sinister, and he sneered, as expected of Ling Yeting's woman, "You are full of thorns." Wei Yang smiled self-deprecatingly and said slowly, "Boss Ding, I don't want to offend you. I can't afford to offend her." But in the end, he still offended. Seeing that he had no intention of touching her again, Wei Yang backed away and walked out. She didn't dare turn her back to him, for fear that he would attack her when she wasn't paying attention. By the time he walked out of the hotel, Wei Yang felt that he was a little unconscious. "My whole body was extremely hot and my head was dizzy. The cheek was swollen after being slapped and it hurt terribly." She walked out holding onto the wall, just wanting to get away from this place as quickly as possible. However, after taking a few steps, she fell into the man's arms. Chapter 9. Are you kidding me? She didn't like to cry, but when she smelled the familiar cold fragrance, her nose still felt very sour. Ling Yeting simply picked her up and Wei Yang did not resist. At this moment, her hands and feet were weak and she couldn't resist even if she wanted to. It was not until she threw her onto the bed that he leaned over and saw her red and swollen face. His expression darkened a little. "You are not very powerful in front of me, but you are beaten in such a short time." The cold fingertips touched her cheek. Wei Yang shrank back and turned her head away from his hand. A hint of displeasure flashed across his face. She looked up at him and suddenly smiled. "Boss Ling, we are all adults, there is no need to ask some questions so directly." Ling Yeting's expression changed slightly. He withdrew his hand and looked at her expressionlessly. As if Wei Yang didn't see his ugly expression, she continued deliberately, "Boss Ling has taught me personally for several years, and now he has found me a client who is so happy to play with me. He really took a lot of trouble." Ling Yeting supported her pillow with one hand, looked down at her, and said in a dangerous tone, "Are you enjoying it?" Wei Yang looked at him and said, "After eating too much delicacies from land and sea, it's not bad to eat street food occasionally. I just didn't expect that Mr. Ding is good looking but useless. He finished before I even started." As she spoke, her fingers slowly touched his chest. "Boss Ling, are you going to give me some extra power?" Ling Yeting was so angry that he laughed. "You are quite capable. Try to piss him off. He is really brave." Wei Yang thought he would be so angry that he would slam the door and leave the next second, but she didn't expect. The short skirt on her body was suddenly lifted up, and his hand went straight up her legs. He actually used this method to test whether she was. Wei Yang seemed to get an electric shock. He instantly stepped back and cursed, "Ling Yeting, you bastard." However, she was now on the bed, pinned down by him, and moving around was just thrashing under him. Wei Yang completely collapsed, looked at him with humiliation, raised her hand and slapped him hard in the face. Bang! Ling Yeting's face turned slightly to the side after being hit, and he turned to look at her with cold eyes. Wei Yan was both scared and angry. "Get out!" Ling Yeting glanced at her indifferently and stood up. This room has long been rented under Ling Yeting's name. He would occasionally stay here when he had social events late. This was not the first time Wei Yan came here with him. He sat down directly on the small sofa in the room and even flipped through some company documents. Wei Yan simply curled up against the bed. She felt like there was a fire burning in her body, burning her mind completely. She wanted to rush into the bathroom and soak herself in the bathtub, but the thought of the child in her belly. Time passes by every second. Leng Yeting's patience was running out. The document in his hand remained unturned for a long time. Leng Yeting raised his eyes and saw Wei Yan curled up in the corner, trembling slightly. Her long hair covered her face, making it impossible to see her expression. He felt something was wrong and stood up. When I got closer, I saw that Wei Yan's face was covered in sweat and his cheeks were red. In order to suppress the restlessness in his body, he bit the back of his hand so hard that it was bleeding. He walked over quickly and tried to pull her hand away. Let go. Wei Yan didn't give him any response. He simply stretched out his hand and pinched both sides of her cheeks with 2 fingers. She felt pain and was forced to let go. Only then did he realize that the back of her hand was already covered in blood. Leng Yeting was so angry that he laughed. You are quite cruel to yourself. Her consciousness was a little fuzzy at this moment, and she was just subconsciously fighting against her body. Smelling his familiar scent, she subconsciously clung to him. She leaned forward slightly and pressed her whole body against him, pressing him directly onto the bed. The lips with a hint of blood pressed directly against his, blocking his lips eagerly. He raised his eyebrows, and lay there letting her tease him randomly, but he soon felt a pain on his lips, and the woman in his arms began to struggle frantically, pushing him away. He licked his lips and unsurprisingly tasted blood. You're kidding me. Chapter 10 I'll kill you if you move again. As soon as she finished speaking, she pounced on him again. Although she said no, she subconsciously snuggled into his arms again. Her hands moved without any control, but it stimulated him to the point of being out of control. However, just as his hand touched the corner of her clothes, she suddenly pushed it away with great force. Again and again. Leng Yeting fell on the bed, his mind filled with swear words. Most of Wei Yan's clothes were torn off, his face was covered with hidden sweat, his expression was a little distorted, and there was an indescribable sexiness to it. The woman was still lying on top of him and doing whatever she wanted, kissing him and hitting him. Leng Yeting's forehead veins were throbbing and he pushed her away. She lay on the bed in a daze for a few seconds, and the next moment he stood up, lifted the quilt and wrapped her whole body in it. The little woman in the quilt was still making a fuss. Leng Yeting said fiercely, I'll kill you if you move again. He tugged at his tie in annoyance. Seeing that it has come to this point, Wei Yan, who clearly wants it but still tries hard to push him away, felt inexplicably depressed in his heart. After a few seconds of silence, Leng Yeting's eyes turned slightly cold, and he took out his cell phone to call Song Ji. After Song Ji heard about the situation, he quickly contacted a private doctor and rushed over. After giving Wei Yan an injection, the man calmed down. Wei Yan was curled up in the quilt with only his head exposed. He had fallen asleep due to exhaustion and looked very well behaved. Song Ji looked at Leng Yeting, who was standing at the head of the bed, his clothes a little messy, and his face full of unsatisfied desires, and whispered, Boss Leng, do you need me to give you? Leng Yeting didn't even raise his head. Get lost. When he woke up the next day, Wei Yan only felt a dull pain in his head, and the memories of the previous night came back to him. The corners of Wei Yan's lips curled up slightly, and he said only 2 words, you deserve it. After checking the messages on her phone, she found out that the buyer had already signed the contract the night before. She simply washed up and went to the agency, reviewed the real estate transaction contract, signed it, and then slowly went to the company. The house was purchased in full by Leng Yeting and given to her as a gift. The buyer she sold it to also paid in full, so there was no need to go through the loan process, so the procedure was much simpler. After she signed, she handed the follow-up matters over to the agent, and while she was on the way, she received the house payment from the other party. After counting the zeros on the transfer amount, Wei Yan's depression from the whole night instantly dissipated a lot. As soon as she sat down at her workstation, she saw another colleague from the secretarial department, Shen Lanshan, approaching her. Sister Yang, President Leng wants you to go to his office. New. Wei Yang responded indifferently. Seeing that she didn't move, Shen Lanshan came over and reminded her, Sister Yang, Mr. Leng doesn't look very happy. He wants you to put down your work and come over right away. Wei Yan curled her lips. I know, go ahead and get busy. Shinlanshan has been working in the secretarial department for a year. She is actually doing a pretty good job at her job, but the people who try to please her are a little too deliberate, and there is an ambition in her eyes that cannot be hidden. Wei Yan curled the corners of his lips, lingered at his workstation for another half an hour before getting up and going to Ling Yeting's office. Considering Ling Yeting's performance last night, she naturally understood that Ling Yeting would not do something like sending her to President Ling to sleep with him while discussing business, which would be embarrassing. However, it did not stop her from being angry at his pretending to be indifferent and not helping. Ling Yeting didn't sleep well the night before, and his face looked very sour, as if the words, "Don't mess with me," were written on his face. Wei Yan brought a cup of coffee, then stood far away and said in a flat tone, "Boss Ling, what do you want?" Ling Yeting glanced at her and said, "Notify the Human Resources Department to start recruiting a chief secretary." Wei Yan looked at him in surprise. "Do you agree to let me go?" Ling Yeting's lips curled slightly, with a hint of sarcasm. "What? Do you think the Ling family can't do without you?" Wei Yan had heard too many of his harsh words, so she just said, "Of course not. I'm just a small secretary. Without President Ling's cultivation, I would be nothing." Ling Yeting looked at her face, which was barely able to suppress her joy, and sneered, "You do have some self-awareness." Wei Yan smiled and said, "I'll arrange it right away." Ling Yeting waved his hand, "Go away." Wei Yan quickly turned around and walked out of his office, his steps becoming much lighter. Ling Yeting frowned as he looked at her back. "Are you so happy that you are leaving him?" Chapter 11. She is pregnant with someone else's child. She didn't know whether Ling Yeting was happy or not, but she was very happy anyway. Wei Yan's face was filled with joy, and he almost hummed a song as he returned to his office. As soon as she sat down, she met Shinlanshan's gaze, which was filled with a bit of uncontrollable sourness. After meeting her eyes, Shinlanshan quickly adjusted her expression and smiled at her. "Sister Yang, what are you so happy about?" Wei Yang restrained his expression and said calmly, "You should know that President Ling hates people below him who are too curious and ask about things they shouldn't ask about." Shinlanshan patted her mouth quickly and said in a coquettish voice, "Sister Yang is teaching me that I was too talkative." Wei Yang glanced at the other people in the secretariat, and everyone immediately straightened their backs and got busy. The chief secretary not only means a salary that has increased several times, but also the qualification to accompany Ling Yeting to various high-end occasions, and even to become Ling Yeting's bedside companion. Even if it's only temporary. Everyone in the secretariat wanted Wei Yang to leave, but no one was as restless as Shinlanshan, whose ambition was almost written on her face. After drafting the recruitment requirements for the chief secretary, Wei Yang poked Ling Yeting and sent the information to him. "Boss Ling, do you have any special instructions regarding the recruitment of the chief secretary?" Ling Yeting took the information and ignored her for a long time. It was almost lunchtime when he replied, "You decide. If it doesn't work, you'll be responsible." Wei Yang. Damn capitalist, he is blackmailing her. Wei Yan cursed silently and informed the Human Resources Department of Ling Yeting's plan to recruit a chief secretary. Almost at the same time as the recruitment message was sent out, other people in the secretariat received the news. The baby has been in her belly for more than a month, and Wei Yang has gradually started to have some morning sickness. She didn't pay attention and ate almost 1/3 of the can of plums she bought a few days ago in just one morning. It was not until her teeth started to feel sour that she came to her senses. She calmly put the plums away in the drawer, then got up and went to the bathroom. She rinsed her mouth and was about to take a tissue to wipe her mouth when she saw Shinlanshan walk in and handed her a tissue in a flattering manner. "Thank you." Wei Yan glanced at her and didn't take it. He took it and wiped his mouth. Shinlanshan pouted and said with a wronged look, "Sister Yang, did I do something wrong to make you unhappy?" Wei Yang narrowed his eyes and looked at her with raised eyebrows. Shinlanshan continued in a low voice, "If I did something wrong, please tell me directly and I will definitely change." Wei Yang laughed, "You don't even know what you did wrong, so you promise that you can change." Shinlanshan smiled and said, "Sister Yang is my senior. If she says I did something wrong, then it must be my fault." Wei Yang curled his lips in a non-committal manner and said nothing. Shinlanshan hesitated to speak. "Sister Yang, are you free after get off work? Let's go shopping together to relax. It's been a long time since we went shopping together." Wei Yang glanced at her and said, "Just tell me what you want to say." Shinlanshan smiled a little embarrassedly and looked around. They were the only two people in the bathroom. She moved closer and lowered her voice, "Sister Yang, I heard that President Ling is going to recruit a chief secretary. Is that true? Wei Yang did not deny the almost public matter and said calmly, yes. Shen Lanxian moved closer and held Wei Yang's arm affectionately. Sister Yang, I know that the chief secretary can be recommended by the previous chief internally. As long as you recommend me, whether it succeeds or not, these are all yours. She held a card between her fingers and tentatively tried to put it into Wei Yang's pocket. As she got closer, the smell of her perfume became stronger. I didn't feel anything before, but now Wei Yang just feels a little out of control. Vomit. Wei Yang suddenly shook off her hand, turned sideways, and let out an embarrassed sound. Shen Lanxian's face turned as black as charcoal in an instant. Wei Yan casually stuffed her bank card back and said, "You don't have enough experience, forget about being the first secretary." Then, she quickly entered the bathroom stall. Shen Lanxian outside the door was so angry that her face turned blue. She stomped her feet and walked out, gritting her teeth and silently said, "Why are you pretending? Didn't you also get promoted to chief secretary after 1 year of employment? I'm just not as good at climbing into bed as you." She didn't expect that after joining the company, she tried her best to please Wei Yang, but Wei Yang didn't even consider helping her and was even unresponsive. She took a few steps and heard the sound of Wei Yang retching in the bathroom. Her expression changed several times, and then she suddenly realized. Retching? Wei Yang suddenly wants to resign. Is she pregnant? Chapter 12, Are you pregnant? The footsteps outside the bathroom door came and went, finally becoming lighter and stopping near her. Wei Yang frowned, trying his best to suppress the urge to vomit that was rising in his throat. Through the gap under the cubicle, one could catch a glimpse of the tip of the red high-heeled shoes worn by the person outside the door. She narrowed her eyes, and a hint of coldness instantly appeared between her brows. After returning to the office, she saw the pair of red high heels on Shen Lanxian's feet at a glance, and her heart trembled a little. Sure enough, as soon as she sat down, she heard Shen Lanxian coming over with a can of plums in her hand. "Sister Yang, I see you like sour food. I have another can of plums here, do you want some?" Wei Yan guessed Shen Lanxian's thoughts almost instantly. This was because openly trying to please her wasn't working, so he was ready to take the risk and kill her. She was calm and smiled as she took it. "Okay, I just happened to have a poor appetite recently and I like to eat sour food." Shen Lanxian smiled and said, "My sister loved sour food when she was pregnant. They say sour boys and spicy girls. If I hadn't known that Sister Yang was single, I should have congratulated you on being pregnant with a son." As she spoke, she raised her voice a little more and said, "By the way, Sister Yang, I heard you retching in the bathroom just now. Did you eat something bad? Is your stomach okay?" He likes sour food and he also has a tendency to dry heave. Shen Lanxian almost said directly that she suspected she was pregnant. It was clearly time for lunch, but no one in the secretariat went to get their meals. They all pretended to be busy at their workstations, with their ears perked up. Wei Yang shook the plums in his hand, glanced at the people in the secretariat, and finally his eyes fell on Shen Lanxian's face. Shen Lanxian's face was full of concern and innocence, but her eyes were filled with malice. The girl's methods were rough and cruel, and she didn't give Wei Yang any chance to get away with it. Seeing Shen Lanxian's almost uncontrollable pride, as if she had something on her, Wei Yang curled her lips and said, "Something's going on. Something big." Shen Lanxian didn't expect her answer. Her face changed and her heart sank instantly. Wei Yang sighed. She took out a bottle of medicine from her office drawer and saw the words, Weisul, clearly written on the bottle. Wei Yang opened it directly and ate 2 pills with water before saying, "Everyone has heard that Ling's company is going to recruit a chief secretary to take over my job. I have had severe stomach pain recently, so I went to the hospital for a physical examination and found that not only is my stomach problem a bit serious, but I also have some occupational diseases. I can no longer do my current job, so I plan to resign and go home to recuperate." Everyone in the secretariat looked at her in surprise. After all, no one expected the reason to be so simple. But no one felt like playing dumb anymore and they all came over to ask about Wei Yang's health. Everyone has some occupational disease. The others immediately felt some sympathy. In fact, it says, Weisul on the bottle, but the vitamins inside had long been replaced by vitamins. Wei Yang ignored Shen Lanxian, whose face was a little pale. After responding to a few other people, he prepared to go downstairs to eat. When she turned around, she saw Ling Yeting standing not far away, looking at her. Wei Yan felt a tingling sensation on his spine instantly, and he didn't know how much of what Ling Yeting had just heard. Come over. He threw down 2 words and turned back to the office. Wei Yan followed silently. On the desk was the lunch she had prepared for him early in the morning. As soon as he entered the office, Ling Yeting stopped, glanced back at her, and his eyes finally stopped on her abdomen. The gaze was so scorching that Wei Yan almost had the illusion that he could see through her belly and see the secret inside. She resisted the urge to avoid him, only to see him raise an eyebrow, his eyes still fixed on her belly, and he asked casually, "Are you feeling uncomfortable?" Chapter 13. Did you have a fight with Mr. Ling? A chill instantly crept up my spine. The fingers hanging at your sides clenched subconsciously. Ling Yeting obviously heard what Shen Lanshan said, but he didn't know whether he was deliberately testing her at this moment. She tried her best to remain calm and deliberately took the initiative to ask, "Boss Ling, are you afraid that I'll get pregnant?" Ling Yeting lowered his eyes, his gaze accurately falling on the location of her uterus. He raised his hand, and his fingers moved down along her chest, finally landing on her lower abdomen. Wei Yang only felt that his finger was like a knife, moving all the way down, bringing with it a coldness that made her lower abdomen so tight that it was a little painful. Ling Yeting's reaction can't be considered happy at all. He withdrew his hand and looked up. Catching a glimpse of the sarcasm in her eyes and eyebrows, he raised his lips and said in a dull tone, "It's better not to." Wei Yang's face suddenly turned much uglier. The mockery in her voice became stronger. "It's a pity that my belly is not doing well. Otherwise, with Mr. Ling's generous personality, after the abortion, maybe he would give me 2 more houses to get rid of me." Ling Yeting snorted coldly, "And then you take the house I gave you and marry another man." Wei Yang's smile became more and more sarcastic. "Boss Ling, no matter how possessive you are, you can't control whether your ex-lover will marry in the future, right?" She was just short of having the words, "None of your business," written on her face. She used to do whatever he wanted, but now she starts to argue with him when they have a disagreement. Ling Yeting listened and felt an indescribable irritation in his heart, and was very upset. He looked at her coldly. "Aren't you afraid that I will regret it and keep you by my side?" Wei Yang's face was visibly tense for a moment, and then he said, "I believe that Mr. Ling is not a person who goes back on his word." She looked serious and alert. His eyebrows suddenly became extremely cold, and he looked at her with a warning and ruthlessness. "Remember, this is your choice." Ling Yeting walked to the desk, pulled out a few documents, said a few words, and then waved his hand. Wei Yang knew that Ling Yeting thought she was tactless and was a little impatient. While she was relieved, she also felt a little bitter. When did he ever give her a choice? Ling Yeting felt that they just no longer had a physical relationship, and they could still function well as superiors and subordinates. But she never thought about how she would feel if she stayed and saw him with another woman one day. She did not slack off at work just because she was about to leave. She still carefully took note of Ling Yeting's arrangements and then turned around and left the office. It was lunchtime and most people had already gone to the company cafeteria to eat. Wei Yang sat down at his workstation and looked through his mailbox. The position of Ling's chief secretary is very valuable and countless people are eyeing it. As soon as the news was released, a large number of resumes poured in. Wei Yang glanced at the resumes sent by the Human Resources Department, quickly screened them, picked out 3 and asked the Human Resources Department to arrange the initial interview, and then she would do the re-interview. After thinking for a while, she took out her cell phone, picked a number and dialed it. After the other party answered, she said calmly, "How long do you plan to recuperate? Aren't you afraid that the position of chief secretary will have nothing to do with you when you come back?" Although Sumai was not in the company, she naturally knew that Ling S was recruiting a chief secretary. Although internal promotions within the company will be given priority, Ling's practice in the past has always been to promote one candidate from within the company and recruit one from outside, with both sides competing for a certain period of time and finally selecting the best one. Only Wei Yang was promoted, and it was Ling Yeting who decided it with just one sentence. As soon as Sumai heard Wei Yang's words, she immediately understood what she meant. However, she still knew the reason behind Ling Yeting's attitude towards her last time and the long vacation he gave her afterwards. It's hard to say whether Wei Yang can marry into the Ling family, but to Ling Yeting, she is definitely a special existence. Such a special person is actually going to resign. When she heard Wei Yang say this, her first reaction was, "Did you have a fight with President Ling?" Wei Yang was silent for a few seconds, then said calmly, "We're done." Chapter 14 being followed. Wei Yang's tone was too indifferent. Sumai smiled and said meaningfully, "No wonder Boss Lin treats you differently." Wei Yang chuckled, with a hint of self-mockery, "As long as the ending is the same, what difference does the process make? What does it matter?" Sumai understood the meaning of her words and sighed, "I will go back to the company tomorrow." Wei Yang didn't say anything more and hung up the phone. She was very efficient and returned to the company early the next morning. When Wei Yan arrived, he saw Sumai surrounded by several colleagues, who were saying with an exaggerated expression, "When we were passing through the tunnel, the car in front of us suddenly collided. The distance between the cars was too close, and it was too late for me to step on the brakes. I could only crash into it with my eyes closed. Before I could react, the car was hit by the car behind. At that time, it was a pincer attack. My legs were no longer able to move." Sumai is the one with the most seniority among these people. Returning to the company at this time of recruiting a chief secretary, everyone else would probably have to think more about it. However, Sumai has the greatest hope after all, and others don't want to ruin the relationship. She spoke in a very serious manner, and the audience nearby also looked frightened and supportive. Seeing Wei Yan coming, everyone greeted her and Sumai blinked at her. Wei Yang found it funny. She just sat down at her workstation when she saw the door of the president's exclusive elevator open. Leng Yeting was followed by Song Ji, and they both walked out of the elevator together. Wei Yang and the others quickly stood up and greeted them. Song Ji's gaze fell on Sumai, who quickly stood up straight. Song Ji then looked at Wei Yang and followed Leng Yeting into the office without stopping. Leng Yeting was like that as usual, with a sullen face, and he didn't even glance at Wei Yang and the others. Sumai carefully moved to Wei Yang's side and lowered her voice and said, "Why do I feel like Mr. Leng has become even colder after not seeing him for a while?" Wei Yang turned on the computer and said without raising his head, "If you're not cold, how can you be cold, Leng?" Sumai's expression was exaggerated. "We haven't seen each other for just a few days, and you dare to make fun of Mr. Leng." Wei Yang smiled slightly, "Do you want to try?" "Don't." Sumai thought of Leng Yeting's irritable and cold look before, and shrank her neck. "I cherish my life." She hurried back to her workstation and did not dare to harass Wei Yang again. Wei Yang handled his work in an orderly manner. In the afternoon, he met two people who had entered the re-examination and felt that both of them were not suitable. The people who came for the interview were all experienced, had great resumes, and looked good. Unfortunately, the interest in Leng Yeting hidden in his eyes was too obvious, and the secretariat was not short of such people. Wei Yang had expected that recruiting the right person sometimes depended on fate. Even if she cannot become the chief secretary, she must at least be pleasing to Leng Yeting, and it would be best if she can meet his needs in that regard. In this way, Leng Yeting could let her go without any regrets. As soon as Leng Yeting agreed, she would leave overnight. After get off work on Friday, she drove straight home. The house has been sold, but she still has some luggage there. Before the handover, she has to bring all the luggage from home to their hotel. As soon as the car drove not far from the company, Wei Yang felt something was wrong. In the rearview mirror, a black car followed her car almost as it drove out of the company garage. Wei Yang did not go home. Instead, he drove aimlessly on the road, choosing roads with more people. After shaking several times, I couldn't get rid of the car, which kept following me. Wei Yang narrowed his eyes, turned the steering wheel and headed towards the company, intending to hide there for a night. Just as she was about to turn the steering wheel, she saw the car behind her suddenly accelerate and crash into the rear of her car at high speed. Chapter 15, Should he save her or not? Wei Yang subconsciously slammed on the brakes and turned the steering wheel to avoid the collision. However, in the end, he couldn't escape and hit the curb directly. Her eyes suddenly widened, she felt dizzy, and her heart was beating violently. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw that the other car was a Hummer, which was very hard. After the collision, the front and back of her car were dented, but the other car seemed to be fine. The other car door opened, and two tall men came out from the left and right and walked towards her. Wei Yang's face changed drastically, and she tried to calm down and start the car again. The other party noticed her intention and quickly rushed to her car. The car door was damaged and could not be locked, so the other party used great force to pull the door open. The other person unbuckled her seatbelt with one hand, clamped her arm with the other hand, and dragged her out. Wei Yang reached out to try to pry his hand away, and tried to apply force to the numb area. Another man stepped forward and slapped her in the face without any mercy. Wei Yang only felt a burning sensation on his face. He was already dizzy from the collision, and now he was even more dizzy from the beating. I only heard that person say, "Want to play tricks?" One on the left and one on the right. The two men dragged her back into their Hummer. As soon as I was thrown into the car, I heard a familiar male voice, "Were you beaten?" She looked up when she heard the voice, only to see President Ding looking at her. He roughly pinched her chin with one hand, looked at her swollen face, and laughed cruelly. It seems that Secretary Wei is not behaving well again. Mr. Ding is a vindictive person. Wei Yang had been cautious during this period, always on guard against revenge from him, but she didn't expect that she would still be targeted. Her body was shaking uncontrollably. She knew it was useless to beg for mercy at this time. She gritted her teeth and said, "Boss Ding, we just had a small misunderstanding before. Why are you so angry?" President Ding gritted his teeth and said fiercely, "Misunderstanding? No woman has ever dared to be so disrespectful to me, Ding Rong. You are a bitch who was played by Ling Yeting. How dare you lay hands on me? How can I swallow this anger if I don't teach you a lesson?" Wei Yan was very nervous, but she forced herself to remain calm. She straightened her body and looked at him with a bit of coldness and arrogance in her eyes. "You also know that I am Ling Yeting's woman. You dare to plot against me like this? Can you really afford the price of offending the Ling family?" Ding Rong narrowed his eyes, sizing up Wei Yang's calm demeanor, and said coldly, "Are you kidding me? Everyone knows that the Ling family is recruiting a chief secretary. How dare you, a mistress who was about to be divorced, claim to be representing the Ling family?" Wei Yang smiled and said, "Ling's is recruiting a chief secretary, but Mr. Ding probably doesn't know that the interviewer is me." Ding Rong moved closer to look at Wei Yang. "As expected of Ling Yeting's secretary, you are so courageous. However, no matter how eloquent you are, you can't change your fate today." Ding Rong winked at the two people next to him. "Drive to the hotel." As soon as he finished speaking, the two men immediately held Wei Yang down. The car was about to start. Wei Yang couldn't help but feel anxious, and quickly said, "Boss Ding, do you really want to ruin the cooperation with Ling Group because of a momentary impulse? You simply don't believe what I said, otherwise you let me call Ling Yeting and I'll ask him to pick me up. After all, Ding Group and Ling Group have a cooperation. If you didn't touch me, even if what happened today happened, Ling Yeting wouldn't do anything to you. If you touch me, I guarantee that Ling Yeting will never let you go." Seeing Wei Yang's confident expression, Ding Rong couldn't help but reveal a hint of hesitation on his face. Wei Yang quickly struck while the iron was hot. "Just make a phone call. You don't want to make a big mistake." Ding Rong then said with a grim expression, "Okay, I'll give you the phone to call him. But if Ling Yeting doesn't care about you, you'd better be prepared to serve me well." As soon as he finished speaking, someone took her handbag and handed her the phone. Wei Yan kept praying in his heart and dialed the phone. When Ling Yeting was in a good mood in the past, he would personally take her out. But now that they have broken up, she is not sure whether Ling Yeting will still be willing to meddle in her affairs. However, thinking about the last time she ran out of Ding Rong's room and Ling Yeting took her away and rescued her, I think he should not just stand by and watch her die. The beeping sound, one after another, seemed like a huge hand playing tricks on Wei Yang's heartstrings, causing her breathing to become a little disordered. Ding Rong looked at her nervous expression and snorted, but his eyes couldn't help but fall on the phone. After 3 consecutive beeps, the call was finally connected. Chapter 16 Ling Yeting Save Me. Wei Yang hurriedly shouted, "Ling Yeting! Ling Yeting save me!" However, the person on the other end of the line did not speak. Instead, a robotic female voice responded to Wei Yang, "The number you dialed is busy. Please." Ling Yeting actually hung up her phone. My heart felt like it was being grabbed by an invisible hand and squeezed hard. The pain was indescribable. Wei Yang held the phone tightly and said quickly, I'll call again." However, before the call could be made, Ding Rong had already snatched the phone and threw it out of the window. The phone was smashed to pieces, taking with it the last bit of hope in Wei Yang's heart. Ding Rong pinched her jaw, his eyes full of viciousness and lust. "Don't struggle. Who is Ling Yeting? He is the most astute businessman in our Anshan. You are a woman who is tired of playing with you. Will he be willing to stand up for you?" At Ding Rong's glance, the car started. Wei Yang's expression changed. She quickly raised her hand and held Mr. Ding's hand, tensing her nerves and saying, "Mr. Ding, you are also a businessman, don't you want benefits? Instead of playing with me to vent your anger, why don't we talk about cooperation?" Ding Rong smiled and said, "What tricks have you come up with?" Wei Yang's face was filled with resentment towards Ling Yeting. "Ling Yeting is ruthless to me, so don't blame me for being ungrateful to him. I have been following him closely for these years, and I have mastered many of Ling's secrets. Don't you want the contract outside Lin City? Mr. Ding, as long as you let me go and we cooperate, I can help you get these things." Ding Rong said nothing, but looked at her with narrowed eyes. Wei Yang's heart was beating fast and he clenched his palms nervously. Of course, she couldn't really betray Ling Yeting. Even if Ding Rong let her go, Ling Yeting would have hundreds of ways to kill her. Ling Yeting is much more ruthless than President Ding. As long as she could trick Ding Rong into letting her go temporarily, she would immediately hide abroad. The money she had was enough for her to stay abroad for a long time. Given Ding Rong's status, even if he wanted to take revenge on her, he wouldn't keep thinking about teaching her a lesson for years. Seeing Ding Rong's expression slightly relaxed, the next second, he smiled contemptuously. Secretary Wei is really naive. Wei Yan's heart sank instantly. Ding Rong laughed coldly. "If I let you go, what if you run away? I prefer to take the initiative rather than handing the right of choice to others. When you become my woman, won't you have to help me obediently?" Wei Yan slumped down to the side, looking at the smug and ugly face of the man in front of her. She just wanted to vomit. Because of excessive grief, there was even a dull pain in the lower abdomen. She held her belly in pain and helplessness, her face full of tears. The car drove all the way to their hotel parking lot. Ding Rong got out of the car first, and the other two men grabbed Wei Yang and dragged him away. She struggled desperately, but all she got in return was a fiery slap in the face from Ding Rong. Ding Rong grabbed her hair and smiled viciously beside her ear. "Secretary Wei, I advise you to be more obedient. If you make me feel comfortable, you will suffer less." Wei Yang looked at him coldly, with a look in his eyes that seemed as if he wanted to skin him alive. Ding Rong saw her look and became even more excited. The hotter the woman, the more exciting it is to play with her. She was looking for an opportunity to escape, but it was obvious that it was not the first time for those men to do this, and they watched her very closely. They went straight into the elevator, and what was even more unfortunate was that they didn't even meet a passerby who happened to be staying in the hotel along the way. It was not until he was dragged into the hotel room and looked at the camera that had been set up in the room that Wei Yang finally understood what Ding Rong had just meant. She was thrown directly onto the bed while her whole body was shuddering. Ding Rong stood beside the bed, taking off his clothes and smiling. "Secretary Wei, don't worry, my brothers will take beautiful and clear photos of you. We can enjoy them together in the future. I promise you will behave yourself. Don't. If Ding Rong really took a picture of something like this, her life would be completely ruined." Wei Yan broke down and started crying, struggling to back away. "Get out! Get out!" Is this how chapter 17 ends? The two men brought by Ding Rong had no intention of leaving. Instead, they teased beside him. "Boss Ding, I will definitely take some photos of your majesty for you to enjoy from all angles." Ding Rong smiled cruelly and said to the two men, "Tie him up first. This bitch has some skills. I can't suffer at her hands again." The two men stepped forward, quickly pinned Wei Yang down, and then tied him up on the bed in a spread eagle position. Her hands and feet were bound, and she struggled desperately but could not move. Faced with such a person, there is no need to even plead for mercy. She knew that the more she begged, the more happily Ding Rong and the others would laugh. The men looked at her as if she were a piece of merchandise, with full of evil taste. Tears have already blurred my vision. Ding Rong had already taken off all his clothes and pounced towards her, his fingers touching and wandering all over her body. Wei Yan slowly closed her eyes and lay there quietly. For a moment, she felt as if her soul had left her body. As long as you don't open your eyes, you won't see such an ugly scene. As long as you don't look at it, it's as if the person being forced is not yourself. She seemed to be floating, watching this extremely ugly drama with an indifferent and detached attitude. There is only one simple thought in my mind. If she was really defiled, maybe she should disappear from this world with her child. It's such a pity that she had to leave before her child was even born. The man's foul breath as he approached made her nerves tingle. A hint of hatred flashed across Wei Yang's face, and the next second he opened his mouth. "R." Ding Rong's ear was bitten by her and he let out a shrill scream. "Let go! Let me go!" Wei Yang bit it hard and soon tasted blood in his mouth. However, there was only one thought in her mind: bite him to death. Ding Rong bent her body and screamed in pain. The other two men rushed over and kicked her legs and waist to force her to let go. Ding Rong used a lot of strength to hit her on the head, and yelled angrily, "Bitch, let go." Wei Yan just felt a sharp pain in his head was buzzing, and his consciousness was a little unclear. Ding Rong was in so much pain that he punched her in the face and eyes several times to vent his anger. My eye sockets quickly became swollen and it hurt so much that I couldn't open my eyes. She simply closed her eyes, and in the darkness and dizziness, numbly waited for the next round of more brutal revenge and beating. Ding Rong covered his ears and yelled like crazy, "You have good teeth. Just wait for me. I will knock your teeth out one by one." She seemed to hear the sound of violent kicking on the door, and someone called her name, followed by the tragic shouts of Ding Rong and others. Ding Rong was kicked to the ground. He looked at the angry man in horror and said in disbelief, "Boss Leng." Wei Yan thought confusedly, maybe it was just hallucination. The person she most hoped would come to rescue her hung up the phone after hearing her cry for help. "Baby, it was Daddy who gave up on us. Wei Yan. Wei Yan. Wake up." Someone held her cheek, and a familiar voice penetrated her dizzy brain and entered her ears. Someone kept calling her name. Wei Yan slowly opened her eyes, and through her tears, she saw the man who had hung up on her before, now looking down at her and calling her name. His brows were furrowed, and there was a hint of anxiety and worry in his eyes. Wei Yan looked at him quietly. Leng Yeting. Chapter 18. He really comes. She didn't say anything, but opened her eyes with some fear, and was tightly held in his arms. The man's hands were shaking slightly, and Wei Yan didn't know if it was partly because of his worry about her. She didn't even move or struggle, and she always felt in a trance that she was just fantasizing. Until Leng Yeting wrapped his coat around her, then picked her up and walked out of the room. Wei Yan looked back and peered inside from the door, only to see Ding Rong and several others lying on the ground, covered in blood and with faces full of pain. She sniffed the familiar cold fragrance on Leng Yeting's body, and then she gradually came back to her senses. "Leng Yeting." Leng Yeting held her hand tightly. "I'm here. It's really him. He really came." The grievance that I had been suppressing suddenly rushed to my heart. She couldn't control her tears any longer. She grabbed the corner of his clothes tightly and cried silently, "Leng Yeting, you bastard." Leng Yeting did not refute, but just hugged her tightly and whispered, "I'll take you to the hospital to treat your wounds." After being kicked and beaten by Ding Rong and his men, her cheeks were already swollen and her eyes were so swollen that she could barely see through them. Just thinking about the hospital. Wei Yan quickly said, "No. No. I don't want to go." Once she goes to the hospital, can she still keep the matter of her child a secret? So what awaits her next is Leng Yeting forcing her to beat the child. She struggled like crazy, and Leng Yeting could hardly control her, so he quickly let her go. As soon as he landed, Wei Yan wanted to run. "I don't want to go. I don't want to go." Leng Yeting was quick to grab the man and then held him tightly in his arms. "You are seriously injured, be obedient." Wei Yan said firmly, biting the back of Leng Yeting's hand without hesitation. "No." Leng Yeting frowned slightly, the back of his hand was in severe pain, and he could feel the woman's determination to break free. Her whole body was tense and trembling, and she was obviously extremely scared and resistant. He let her bite it, holding her hand tighter. "Calm down first, calm down. If you don't want to go, then don't go." Wei Yan paused and looked up at him. "Really?" She had a miserable expression and looked extremely pitiful and helpless. It was as if he was the one who bullied her. Leng Yeting looked at her like this and his voice softened unconsciously. Leng Yeting nodded, raised his hand and touched the top of her head to comfort her. "I'll ask the doctor to come and see you, go and rest first." Wei Yan finally breathed a sigh of relief. The next second, she felt her legs go weak and she fell into his arms, only able to stand firmly by leaning on his chest. Leng Yeting picked her up and took her into another room. Leng Yeting put her on the sofa. Wei Yan was wrapped in his coat, curled up, her body still trembling slightly uncontrollably, but this time she was tense and there was no expression on her face. Song Ji brought over the medicine box and left. Leng Yeting took it, looked at her pitiful appearance, frowned and said nothing, then found the ointment and applied it to her himself. Wei Yan's tense nerves could no longer bear it and tears fell silently. She seldom cried in front of him. Even when he bullied her to the extreme in bed in the past, even when her voice was hoarse, she just looked at him stubbornly with red eyes. At that time, Ling Yeting thought that he should use more force and bully her until she cried and begged for mercy. But when he really saw her crying, Ling Yeting felt very upset again. He couldn't help but apply the medicine with more force. Wei Yan hissed in pain and glared at him. Ling Yeting said expressionlessly, "Stop crying." If it weren't for his indulgence, how could Ding Rong dare to bully her like this? If it hadn't been for that incident in the hotel, there would have been no revenge. If he had answered her call for help, she would not have suffered so much and Ding Rong would have released her long ago. So at this moment, even though he arrived in time, Wei Yang became more and more angry the more he thought about it. She ignored him and cried even harder. Ling Yeting became more and more annoyed, and his tone became heavier. He said sternly, "Don't cry." She frowned and glared at him, her tone was not very good. "What do you care?" The veins on Ling Yeting's forehead jumped, and he looked down at the miserable appearance of the woman in his arms. He stopped and his eyes suddenly became deep. Wei Yang's heart skipped a beat subconsciously. By the time she reacted, Ling Yeting had already grabbed her collar. With a slight force, she moved closer to his arms. His lips, somewhat cool, pressed against hers, and he held her lips almost fiercely. Chapter 19, she is a professional at making him angry. He threw away the medical cotton swab in his other hand, grabbed her waist, and hugged her in his arms. Wei Yang was forced to look up, and realizing his dominance, the feeling of grievance in her heart became even more intense. Ling Yeting tasted the salty taste of tears and blood on her lips, and then he realized that she was crying even harder. Ling Yeting subconsciously let her go and raised his hand to wipe her tears. Wei Yang slapped him away, looking extremely aggrieved, and shouted, "You bully me too. What's the difference between you and Ding Rong? Ling Yeting. Has he fallen to the point where he has to be compared with Ding Rong Lai?" Seeing the woman's ungrateful look, Ling Yeting was irritated by her. He looked at her expressionlessly. "If I really want to force you, no one can save you." Wei Yang's whole body went numb. "Is this the reason why you didn't help?" He looked a little puzzled. "When did I not help someone in need?" Wei Yang's expression turned cold. Indeed, he did not stand by and watch someone die. He only came after she had been taught a lesson, to let her know that she couldn't afford to offend him. Wei Yang stared at him, then suddenly stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Ling, for your timely rescue today. I will leave now. Don't worry, I will find a suitable person to take over my job as soon as possible and won't let you worry too much about a small person like me." She walked out while talking. She said this in a tough tone, but not so toughly, because her clothes were torn and she could only wrap herself in his coat, which made her look inferior. Ling Yeting looked at her coldly, his tone full of sarcasm. "Secretary Ling is really good at this trick of crossing the river and destroying the bridge." Wei Yan paused, clenched his palms, and suddenly turned back to look at Ling Yeting. "Boss Ling, today, I sincerely thank you for saving me. But if there is nothing else, I hope you can just tell me to get out, or you can give me some more money and let me get out. In short, leave her alone." Ling Yeting looked at the ungrateful woman in front of him and almost wanted to strangle her to death. Wei Yang has really grown up. He used to be so obedient, but now he is so annoying. He didn't even need to do anything, she had already been beaten terribly, but her temper was as hard as a stone in a pit, which made him truly realize the many facets of women. Ling Yeting was so angry that he was furious. She was tactless and asked again, "Boss Ling, do you have any other instructions?" Ling Yeting looked at her and said only one word, "Get lost." Wei Yan rolled his eyes without hesitation and just left. She just wants to leave this city immediately and doesn't want to get involved in these things at all. The scent of the woman in the air faded. Ling Yeting stood there for a long time and finally kicked the sofa. Songji was about to look for Ling Yeting, but he saw Ling Yeting walking out with a violent look on his face, and Wei Yan was gone. Seeing Ling Yeting's expression, Songji was startled. He didn't dare to ask where Wei Yan was going. He just asked, "Boss Ling, how about Ding Rong?" Ling Yeting was filled with anger and went straight to the room where Ding Rong was. Ding Rong and the two bodyguards he brought with him were beaten until they were covered in blood. The wife he married in his early years came from a family with some influence, and she started her career by being involved in gangs. She has been doing quite well in Anqing in recent years. It is precisely because everything is going smoothly that I feel a little proud. Ling Yeting entered the room, sat down on the sofa, looked down at the people on the ground, and said in a playful tone, "You play with women, and you play with me, Ling Yeting." Ding Rong cried out in his heart, "Boss Ling, Boss Ling." This is all a misunderstanding, it's really all a misunderstanding. I believed the rumors and thought you and Secretary Wei had broken up. Otherwise, even if I had 100 guts, I wouldn't dare to touch your woman. Song Ji kicked him immediately. This Ding Rong is really stupid. Even if this woman is someone Ling Yeting is tired of playing with, he has no right to think about her, let alone say it in front of Ling Yeting. Ling Yeting narrowed his eyes, took out a cigarette from his arms, and took 2 puffs. In the smoke, I seemed to see Wei Yan's pitiful and angry face. His inner irritation became more and more serious. He flicked his 2 fingers and the remaining half of the cigarette in his hand flew out and fell on Ding Rong. Ding Rong was scolded and shrank back, not daring to make a sound. He stared at Ling Yeting, as if waiting for the emperor's verdict. Ling Yeting stood up and left, his voice dull and ruthless. Doesn't he like to knock people's teeth out one by one? Let him experience it himself first. Chapter 20 Bleeding. Wei Yan left the hotel and shivered in the cold wind outside. She wrapped herself even tighter around Ling Yeting's coat. There was still his cold scent on the clothes, familiar and cruel. She had intended to deliberately displease Yi Ting and then find an excuse to leave, but at this moment, she felt a slight pain in her lower abdomen. Wei Yan was panicked, so she stood on the side of the road, hailed a taxi, and went to the hospital. Her cell phone was broken, so the driver followed her upstairs to find Yao Yao and get the fare before leaving. Yao Yao had just finished surgery and was about to go home to rest. When she saw her, she was startled and asked repeatedly, "What happened? Who did it? Could it be Ling Yeting?" Wei Yang held her hand tightly, shook his head, and said softly, "Yao Yao, my stomach hurts." Yao Yao didn't bother to ask anything else and immediately wrote an order for Wei Yang to go for a checkup. During the examination, Wei Yang discovered some bleeding symptoms, which made him even more uneasy. When they got the test results, Yao Yao's face didn't look good, and Wei Yang's face was pale as hell. They quickly took the test sheet and looked at the data on it in detail. Yao Yao comforted her, "Don't be so nervous. It's normal to have some bleeding in early pregnancy. Your progesterone level is low. Take some progesterone capsules to stabilize it. You should just rest at home during this time." Wei Yang held her belly anxiously. Knowing the theoretical knowledge was one thing, but it was another thing entirely when it really happened to her. Perhaps only she herself knows how difficult it was for her to carry this child. After getting the medicine, she went back home to get her luggage, and carried the suitcase back to a hotel near the company alone. As the chief secretary, she had to tell Ling Yeting if she wanted to ask for leave and wait for his personal approval. Wei Yang hesitated for a moment, but still dialed his number. Ling Yeting's awkwardness was still there, and his voice was very cold. "Speak." Wei Yang pursed her lips. After all, she had to ask for help, so she lowered her voice a few notches. "Boss Ling, I'm not feeling well. I'd like to take a week off." In order to protect the fetus, Yao Yao suggested that she should rest in bed this week, and then go to the hospital for a checkup. If the indicators improve, she can consider continuing to go to work. Ling Yeting was silent for a few seconds before he said, "Approved." Wei Yang breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you." Ling Yeting hung up the phone directly, and his fingers casually operated a few times on the keyboard, and Wei Yang's face instantly appeared on the computer screen. Ding Rong wanted to take a video of him and Wei Yang to threaten her, so he recorded the whole process of him and his 2 men beating Wei Yang. Ling Yeting looked at the woman in the camera whose eyes were full of despair. The anger in his heart had no way of being relieved, so he threw the monitor to the ground with his backhand. Songji was working next door to him. When he heard the noise, he hurried over. Looking at the mess on the ground, he was a little shocked and asked, "Boss Ling, what happened?" Ling Yeting tugged at his tie, his collar slightly open, his whole body exuding a bloody and violent aura. "How is the situation with the Ding family going?" Songji said quickly, "Ding Rong has been imprisoned. The evidence we provided is enough for him to spend the rest of his life in prison. Ding's accounts are also being investigated. It is expected that the acquisition can be completed within 3 working days." Ling Yeting leaned back in his chair, raised his eyes slightly, and gave Songji invisible pressure. "Find a few people to keep an eye on him, don't let him have it so easy." Songji looked stern and nodded, "Yes." Ling Yeting waved at Songji. Songji turned around and walked a few steps out, but couldn't help but look back at Ling Yeting. Maybe even Ling Yeting himself didn't know that he actually cared about Wei Yan a lot. Whether it's out of like or out of habit. Song Ji couldn't help but say, "Boss Ling, if you regret it, you can have a good talk with Secretary Wei. She has a good temper and should be easy to coax." Good temper? Leng Yeting sneered. He once thought so too, but Wei Yan slapped him in the face. Song Ji's words made him feel a sense of crisis. After a few seconds of silence, he spoke, "I never regret it." Chapter 21 Company Rumors. Wei Yang stayed in bed in the hotel for a whole week, and even had to have meals delivered to his room. In fact, she really shouldn't have been so obsessed with this child. Life is long, who can guarantee that she will meet the right person in the future? Why should she tie herself to Leng Yeting? However, Wei Yang did not expect that once he fell into Leng Yeting's trap, he would never be able to get out. She insisted on being stubborn and was willing to bear the consequences. Only after making sure that there was nothing wrong with her health did Wei Yan cancel her leave and return to the company. Several people in the office were gathered in the tea room with their backs to her, chatting animatedly, and did not notice her arrival. I only heard Sumai among the few people say faintly, "Boring." Shen Lanshan replied, "I'm telling you what I'm telling you. Believe it or not, I'm not forcing you to listen." Sumai rolled her eyes, turned around with her coffee and was about to leave, only to see Wei Yang standing beside them, looking at them with a blank expression. Sumai paused, a mischievous smile suddenly appeared on her face. She threw a wink at Wei Yang, then turned around and said to Shen Lanshan, "Shen Lanshan, you have to have evidence when you speak. Special Assistant Song said that Secretary Wei was on a business trip, but how come you said that Secretary Wei can't come back? If you know some big gossip, just say it if you have the guts. There's no point in hiding it." Shen Lanshan's face flashed with pride. "I know, but I won't tell you. Anyway." During the days when Wei Yang was on leave, Sumai contacted her and told her that Shen Lanshan was plotting against her behind her back. She also knew that Song Ji was covering up for her and specifically told others that she was on a business trip. Wei Yang didn't have time to think about Shen Lanshan at that time, but now he felt a little strange. Why was Shen Lanshan so sure that she would never come back? Before Shen Lanshan finished her words, someone saw Wei Yang and hurriedly shouted in panic, "Secretary Wei. Good morning. Good morning." They were caught talking about others behind their backs, and they all looked very embarrassed. Shen Lanshan's back was stiff, and she turned to look at Wei Yang, as if she couldn't believe her presence. However, she quickly adjusted her expression and said awkwardly, "Good morning, Secretary Wei." Wei Yang glanced at her with a half-smile and ignored her. How could Shen Lanshan not understand that Sumai had said that on purpose to trick her? She turned her head and glared at Sumai. Sumai had a smile on her face. She drank coffee and moved closer to Wei Yang. If you don't come back, some people will lose their own weight. They will be so arrogant that they are afraid that others don't know what they are thinking." Shen Lanshan looked embarrassed and quickly returned to her workstation. Wei Yang ignored her and returned to his workstation to sit down, only to find that Shen Lanshan was peeking at him with a puzzled look on her face. Wei Yang looked at her like that, and suddenly had some guesses in his mind. Leng Yeting entered the company and walked towards the office at lightning speed. He glanced at Wei Yang and saw someone sitting next to him. He paused, glanced at her, and walked into the office as usual. When Shen Lanshan saw Leng Yeting, her eyes lit up and she immediately said while holding the document, "Boss Leng, I have some work to report to you." Wei Yang looked at her following Leng Yeting happily, and the corners of his lips curled up very slowly with a hint of sneer. Shen Lanshan followed Leng Yeting almost every step of the way. Wei Yan watched them enter the office. After a while, he sorted out the documents and prepared to give them to Leng Yeting for signature. She raised her hand and knocked on the door. Leng Yeting's voice inside the room was cold, "Come in." Wei Yang opened the door and went in. He saw Shen Lanshan leaning over and talking to Leng Yeting. Her angle was perfect, and he could easily see the scenery of her chest when he raised his eyes. Chapter 22 Are You So Afraid of Me? Wei Yang found it very funny when he saw Shen Lanshan twisting like a snake, wishing she could strip naked and sit on Leng Yeting's lap. Based on her understanding of Leng Yeting, Shen Lanshan was afraid that she might have gone too far. Leng Yeting signed the document expressionlessly, his voice becoming a little colder, "Get out." Shen Lanshan then looked unwilling and slowly stood up. She held the document in her arms, and still looked shy and reluctant when she said to Leng Yeting, "Boss Leng, I'll go out first." Leng Yeting didn't react at all. Shen Lanshan bit her lip, turned around and walked out, glancing at Wei Yang unhappily, as if she thought she was in the way. After Shen Lanshan left, Wei Yang walked to Leng Yeting's desk and said, "Boss Leng, do you think I need to take another week off? If he had come back a week later, there would be no need to recruit people. Maybe he would have directly decided on Shenlanshan. Her tone was calm, but Ling Yeting could hear a hint of sarcasm in it. Ling Yeting raised his eyebrows and looked at her. After a week of recuperation, the wounds on the woman's face had healed and were as smooth as before. She no longer looked as disheartening as she had the last time they met. She has a beautiful face, and even with very light makeup, she looks more beautiful than others. Ling Yeting raised his chin slightly. Come here. It was just an ordinary action, but he did it with a hint of arrogance. Wei Yan took 2 steps closer, but looked at him warily. What does Mr. Ling want to say? Ling Yeting didn't say anything, just stared at her, his eyes vaguely threatening. Wei Yan had no choice but to move a little closer. Ling Yeting suddenly stretched out his hand and exerted a little force. She lost her balance and was pulled over into his arms. Ling Yeting sniffed a few times calmly. Unlike Shenlanshan, the strong smell of perfume on her body made him extremely annoyed. The feminine scent on Wei Yang's neck was subtle but easily aroused his nerves. Wei Yang struggled, holding her hands on his chest, her face full of annoyance. Ling Yeting. Ling Yeting leaned back in the chair, one hand clasping her slender waist. Although he looked up at her, his gaze revealed a bit of evil, and his tone was lazy, looking for trouble. Wei Yang has followed him for so many years, and he knows this aspect well enough, if not anything else. Ling Yeting's expression clearly showed that he was a little emotional. She didn't know what had irritated him, so she just straightened her body and said, "How dare I? But if Mr. Ling really likes Shenlanshan, just let me know, and it will save the colleagues in the HR department from having to work so hard." Ling Yeting sneered, "Is there anything you dare not do? Not only do you dare to treat me as a man who only thinks with his lower body, but you also dare to insult my aesthetics. Shenlanshan looks okay, but she is a little petty after all. There are too many women who want to climb into Ling Yeting's bed, from rich socialites to film and television queens, and Shenlanshan really can't rank among them." In fact, Wei Yang didn't know why he fell in love with her back then and even took the initiative to find her. It was also because of those little differences that occasionally revealed themselves in the minor details when Ling Yeting was with her at the beginning that she naively believed that she was different to him. Until he broke her fantasy himself. Wei Yang looked at him deeply before saying, "If you don't like it, then don't like it. Let me go. I have to go out to work." Ling Yeting's fingertips slid across her waist. Wei Yang's whole body tensed up and she looked at him as if she were guarding against a thief. Ling Yeting raised his eyes slightly. "Are you afraid of me?" Wei Yan was held in his hand, so how could he say anything? He bared his teeth and said, "This is not fear, this is respect." Ling Yeting had a smile in his eyes. As soon as he pulled his hand away, she quickly stood up and straightened her clothes. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything else. He looked at the documents she brought, signed his name, and said calmly, "Accompany me to the cage at 9 o'clock. Wei Yan was stunned for a few seconds before nodding. The cage was opened by Ling Yeting's good brother Fu Morshing for his lover Ji Liang. It is highly private and membership-based, with the annual membership fee alone costing over $1 million. It is a place frequented by Ling Yeting and his circle. Wei Yang has followed Ling Yeting for so many years and has a good relationship with Ji Liang. Just say goodbye before leaving." Wei Yang looked at Ling Yeting as he lowered his head and prepared to continue reading the documents. She wanted to annoy him, so she imitated Shenlanshan's behavior just now and said in a pinched voice, "Boss Ling, I'll leave first." Ling Yeting tightened his knuckles holding the pen, raised his eyes, and saw Wei Yang imitating Shenlanshan's way and walking out with his waist twisted. Although it's just a back view, it's full of provocation. At this moment, he just wanted to teach this woman who deliberately angered her a lesson and watch her beg for mercy under him. Chapter 23. She can't give him what he wants. Ling Yeting and his friends have a special VIP room in Fanlong, which is 4 or 5 times larger than an ordinary room and has a full range of drinks and entertainment options. Even those who don't like playing can find fun in it. Wei Yang followed Ling Yeting to the cage on time and saw Ji Liang and Fu Morshing were already there. Ji Liang was dressed hot and sexy, and was being kissed by Fu Morshing on the sofa. This was not the first time Wei Yang had seen this, and she couldn't help but blush as she secretly glanced at Ling Yeting from the corner of her eye. Ling Yeting was already full of evil fire. When he noticed her gaze, he raised his eyes and looked at her. His eyes were extremely penetrating, like a knife that was so cold that it gave the illusion of heat, cutting her clothes bit by bit. In his eyes, she was suddenly naked. Ling Yeting curled the corners of his lips and leaned over. He was already a bit taller than her, and when he leaned over slightly, it made her feel even more oppressive. Ling Yeting's voice was slightly hoarse. Secretary Wei wants it too. Ling Yeting had handsome features to begin with, and when he came so close to her, Wei Yan swallowed subconsciously. She took a step back and knocked on the door in panic. Fu Moshing turned his head to look at the door and muttered, "You guys came at the right time." There was another person in the corner, dressed in black and exuding a defiant aura, playing billiard alone. It was Ling Yeting's other good brother, Zhang Beiming. Hearing the noise, Zhang Beiming turned around to look in their direction, and Ling Yeting walked straight towards him. Among the 4 major families in Anqing today, Ling Yeting and Fu Moshing each own one, and the other 2 are the Mu family and the Chu family. However, in recent years, the Chu family has gradually declined, while the Zhan family has developed rapidly and has already gained a place among the new 4 major families. Ji Liang pushed Fu Moshing away and said, "All right, get out of here." Ji Liang followed Fu Moshing when she was 18 years old. She became pregnant that year, but Fu Moshing forced her to have an abortion. The child was gone, and she wanted to withdraw, but Fu Moshing wouldn't let her. Neither give a status nor release the person. Later, in order to compensate her, Fu Moshing opened this private club for her to ensure that she would have no worries about food and clothing in her next life. At that time, Ji Liang named the club Fanlong, meaning that it was a cage that restricted her freedom, in order to annoy and mock Fu Moshing. Fu Moshing was not angry when he was pushed away. He pinched her waist, stood up and walked towards Ling Yeting. "Want a game?" Ling Yeting walked towards the billiard table with him tacitly. Ji Liang smiled and called Wei Yan, "Yang Yan, come here." Wei Yan smiled and sat down next to her. Ji Liang reached out and held her face, looking at her carefully for a while before saying, "You've recovered quite well." Wei Yan was stunned and looked at her in surprise. "How do you know?" Ling Yeting is not a talkative person, so he probably wouldn't specifically talk to them about Ding Rong. Ji Liang looked at the confusion on her face and smiled. "Didn't Ling Yeting tell you? Zhang Beiming happened to see you being bullied by Ding Rong and called him, otherwise how could he have arrived so in time?" Wei Yang felt something was wrong and pinched his fingers unconsciously. Did Ling Yeting go there after receiving a call from Zhang Beiming? What about the phone call she made? She thought Ling Yeting hung up the phone on purpose to embarrass her, and then went to save her. Only now did she realize, she seemed to have misunderstood him. Ji Liang lazily leaned on the sofa, every move was full of charm, picked up the wine glass and took a sip of wine, and asked directly, "What's going on between you and Ling Yeting?" Although Ling Yeting didn't care about Wei Yang, Zhang Beiming said that he was very anxious when he received the call and rushed over immediately. Moreover, the news that Ding's company was acquired by Ling's company had already spread. But if there was no problem between the 2 of them, how could a person like Ding Rong dare to covet Ling Yeting's woman? She asked directly, and Wei Yang did not hide her intentions. "Sister Liang, I came here to say goodbye to you today. I have already submitted my resignation, and I will leave Anqing when I find someone to take over the job. There will probably be fewer opportunities to see you again in the future." To say "few" is an embellishment. After leaving Anqing, she will probably never have the chance to come into contact with people in this circle again. Ji Liang paused while drinking, and then asked, "Is he willing to let you go?" Wei Yang said calmly, as if he was not the one being abandoned, "It was President Leng who brought it up first." Ji Liang turned around to look at Ling Yeting and suddenly said, "I'm afraid it won't be that easy to part ways amicably." The 2 chatted for a few more sentences before Wei Yang stood up and walked to Ling Yeting's side. But she didn't look at him. Instead she said to Zhang Beiming, "Mr. Zhang, Ding Rong's matter is all thanks to you. If there is anything I can do for you in the future, just let me know." Zhang Beiming glanced at Ling Yeting beside him and said with a half smile, "I just made a phone call to report the news. If you want to thank someone, you should thank someone for running fast enough." Wei Yang straightened up and said to Zhang Beiming and Ling Yeting together, "Yes, thank you, Mr. Zhang, and thank you, Mr. Leng. I will never forget your kindness." Ling Yeting suddenly said, "I will never forget your kindness, and you just say such a light thank you." Wei Yang was stunned for a few seconds by his sudden attack, and then looked at him quietly. "What do you want me to do, Mr. Leng?" Ling Yeting said slowly, "I'll tell you when I think it through. Then take your time to think about it." Wei Yang was too lazy to pay attention to his madness and turned away. Fu Moshing was trying to hold back his laughter. "Your secretary, Is this a genetic mutation? Did the cat turn into a tiger? Ling Yeting ignored him, bent down and hit a hole in one, and then looked at him. Are you free? If you have time for gossip, practice your skills first. Wei Yan turned around and left, going straight to the bathroom. Ling Yeting's cell phone was placed aside, and she picked it up. Having been together day and night for so many years, his cell phone password was no longer a secret to her. She didn't bother to look at the contents of his phone, but went straight to the call records. She flipped through the pages of the day when she was captured by Ding Rong, and read them one by one, and found that there was no call record of that call in Ling Yeting's phone. Instead, about 10 minutes later, there was a call from Zhang Beiming. Ling Yeting definitely wouldn't have the leisure to deliberately delete the call record, and then go to rescue her after answering Zhang Beiming's call. Then, there is only one possibility: someone answered her call, cutting off her chance to ask for help, and then deleted the record, destroying the evidence. Who could this person be? Chapter 24. I am Ling Yeting's woman. Wei Yan went through all the possible people in his mind, and the answer was obvious. The coldness in her eyes became even more intense, and she secretly put Ling Yeting's phone back. Ji Liang was temporarily called out to deal with the club's affairs. Ling Yeting and Fu Morxing sat together with others, not avoiding her, and were talking about the cooperation among several companies. She had no intention of listening to this and went straight out of the room to get some fresh air. It wasn't even the busiest time yet, but many people were already drinking and their faces were red. The music in the lobby was booming, and many people were dancing on the dance floor, twisting their bodies and venting their repressed or manic emotions. Hormones filled the air, desire and lust were all over the floor. Wei Yang found a secluded corner and sat down quietly, but suddenly he felt like someone was staring at him. She turned around and saw a young man staring at her with undisguised aggression in his eyes. He was not born with a handsome face, but his whole body was bright, his appearance was sleek and high profile, and the domineering look between his eyebrows vaguely revealed that his identity was not ordinary. He was caught peeking, and when he met her gaze, he not only did not shy away, but took another glass of wine and walked forward with a smile, alone. Although she had never seen him before, she had seen photos of everyone in the Ling family early in the morning, so she recognized him at a glance. He was Ling Qinrui, the son of Ling Yeting's aunt. Ling Yeting's aunt Ling Xinyue's husband Jiang Xiangming married into the family, so Ling Qinrui took her surname. She behaved like a rich girl, and spoiled Ling Qinrui to the point of being extremely domineering and arrogant. Ling Qinrui made a mistake before and was sent abroad for a few years, but unexpectedly he came back. Wei Yang did not take his wine, but smiled and said, "Thank you for the wine, Mr. Ling, but I have been feeling sick recently, so I am afraid I can only live up to Mr. Ling's kindness." Ling Qinrui looked at her without any hesitation. The woman was different from the other women present. Some were seductive, some were charming, and all were dressed up specially. She was wearing a professional suit and looked lazy. Nothing around her seemed to attract her attention. Her laziness revealed a bit of unconscious sexiness and beauty. He had seen many women, but she caught his attention at first sight. He was not angry when he was rejected, but smiled and said, "Do you know me?" Wei Yang said politely, "Of course, I am President Ling's secretary. It is part of my job to recognize every face in the Ling family." Ling Qinrui raised his eyelids, and the look he gave Wei Yang suddenly became more different. He said playfully, "So it's you." Wei Yang couldn't help but tighten her hands that were hanging by her side. She said calmly, "Then I won't bother you, Master Ling. You can enjoy your time." Ling Qinrui said nothing, just looked at her with a smile. Wei Yang turned around and was about to leave, but just as she took a step, Ling Qinrui suddenly reached out and hugged Wei Yang's waist, leaning over and saying with a smile, "Why are you in such a hurry? Since you are our Ling family's secretary, isn't it just right for you to play with me?" Wei Yang's expression changed drastically, and her tone was filled with warning. "Mr. Ling, please let go immediately. I am Ling Yeting's woman." Ling Qinrui reeked of alcohol and spoke in a muddy tone, "What's wrong with his woman? Do you think I'll be scared if you bring him up? She's his woman, and it's more fun to play with her." He laughed and came over to kiss Wei Yang. Wei Yang felt nauseated by the smell of alcohol on his breath. She turned her head away and almost vomited. She struggled hard and raised her hand to tear his arm off. Before she could do anything, her arm was suddenly grabbed by someone. Wei Yang looked back and saw Ling Yeting appearing at some point. He grabbed her wrist with force and then kicked Ling Qinrui in the chest. He kicked without mercy. Ling Qinrui screamed and was kicked 2 or 3 meters away. Ling Qinrui was so angry that he yelled, Who dares to kick me? Ling Yeting looked down at him, the murderous look on his face almost making people afraid to approach him. Want to fight back? Chapter 25. Are you waiting for me to kiss you? When Ling Qinrui heard his voice, he sobered up a lot. He looked at Ling Yeting awkwardly. Brother, why did you suddenly attack? Ling Yeting looked at him indifferently. You are worthy of coveting my woman. Ling Qinrui then realized that Ling Yeting had heard what he had just said, and his expression changed. Ling Yeting has been cold-hearted since he was a child, and his methods are very ruthless. Even his mother Ling Xinyu was a little afraid of him, let alone Ling Qinrui. He had committed a crime before, and although his mother paid money to settle it, Ling Yeting said something and he was sent abroad for 3 years. Only recently did Ling Yeting finally allow him to return home. It is for this reason that Ling Qinrui hates Ling Yeting in his heart. However, no matter how unwilling or jealous he was in his heart, on the surface he was still as timid as a grandson. Ling Qinrui's expression changed, and he quickly showed a flattering attitude. I was just joking because I was drunk just now. How dare I touch your woman? As he said this, his eyes lingered on Wei Yan for a moment, with a sinister look in them. Wei Yan was sensitive to men's gazes, so she hid behind Ling Yeting without making a sound. Ling Qinrui originally came with a few friends. Seeing him being humiliated, those friends looked at Ling Yeting's face and quickly dragged him away. There were only 2 of them left. Wei Yan struggled and pulled her hand out of Ling Yeting's grasp. She lowered her eyes and whispered, Thank you, Mr. Ling, for helping me out. Ling Yeting looked back at the pale-faced woman beside him and discovered that she seemed to be looking unwell recently. The soft touch on his palm disappeared, and he twisted his fingertips, not very happy. She just claimed to be Ling Yeting's woman, but now she is in a hurry to distance herself from him. Ling Yeting lowered his eyes. Secretary Ling's ability to cross the river and destroy the bridge is getting more and more powerful. Wei Yan smiled and poked back calmly. This is not a case of crossing the river and destroying the bridge. At most, it is just inconstancy. It's all because of Boss Ling's good teaching. Ling Yeting looked at her sharp-tongued appearance, suddenly approached and leaned close to her. Wei Yan subconsciously leaned back a little and looked at him defensively. What are you doing? He didn't say anything, but just stared at her closely, his eyes focused and serious. Wei Yan felt uneasy at the sight of him, and inexplicably, uncomfortable. Her cheeks flushed slightly. She reached out and pushed his chest. What are you crazy about? Ling Yeting looked at her shy face and suddenly smiled lightly. Why are you shy? Do you think I want to kiss you? Indeed, for a moment, she had this illusion. Being hit on the heart by Ling Yeting, Wei Yan's face turned even redder, and she became even more embarrassed and angry. I didn't. Ling Yeting didn't listen, but continued, Or are you actually waiting for me to kiss you? Wei Yan looked up at him. She had to admit that no matter when, he was like poison to her, making her heart beat uncontrollably. The man's handsome face was right in front of her, and because he had caught some of her thoughts, there was a smile on the corner of his lips. She only had to stand on tiptoe to kiss him. For a moment, she actually wanted to do that. But she just quickly lowered her eyes. Boss Ling, stop joking. If you have a mistress for 4 years, it can be a beautiful story of long-lasting love, but if you have a mistress for 40 years, it becomes a joke. He is Ling Yeting. The Ling family will not agree, and neither will he himself. And she would not allow herself to fall into that situation again. Chapter 26. She is the one behind the scenes. Her mood dropped almost visibly. Ling Yeting only felt as if he was watching a delicate flower withering in an instant before his eyes. Ling Yeting frowned and raised his hand to hold her, but Wei Yan took a step back first. Her tone was cold and polite. Boss Ling, I'm not feeling well. Please tell Sister Liang and the others. I'll go back first. After saying that, she turned around and left quickly without waiting for his response. His steps were hurried and urgent, as if he was some kind of monster. She hurried out of the cage and got into the car. Her eyes were already red. The pain of Songji notifying her and Ling Yeting of the end of their relationship was like dealing with an expired rag. It seemed to arrive delayed, piercing her to the bone. If she wasn't pregnant, even though she knew it would be fruitless, she would still waste all her time on Ling Yeting until she grew old and ugly, until he was completely fed up with her and kicked her away, never looking back at her again, and only then would he completely give up. She arrived at the company early the next morning. However, she did not go directly to her workstation, but went to the monitoring room with some breakfast. Although her position is not high, many people are willing to help her because of her status. The people in the monitoring room were a little surprised to see her. Wei Yan had an embarrassed smile on her face. "I'm sorry, could you please help me copy the surveillance footage of our office? I lost my USB drive and can't find it." The area she wanted to check was not sensitive, and the people in the monitoring room were happy to do her a favor. Wei Yan took the surveillance video back to his workstation and opened it on his computer. Recalling the approximate time of that day, she fast-forwarded the surveillance video to the time when she was captured by Ding Rong. Of course, he couldn't get the surveillance footage of Ling Yeting's office, but there happened to be a camera position at the door of his office. Wei Yan patiently looked through it, and after a while, he saw a familiar figure walking in. When the man came out, his expression was a little panicked, and he uncontrollably looked in the direction of her workstation several times. Wei Yan's expression suddenly turned cold, and his fingers unconsciously clenched the mouse. Shin, Lan, Shin. Originally, she thought that it would be a good idea to avoid unnecessary trouble and find someone to take over her job as soon as possible and leave the Ling family. But some people just don't want her to have an easy life. Noisy footsteps were heard, and as soon as Shin Lanshin stepped out of the elevator, she met Wei Yan's icy eyes. There was a vague feeling in the office that a storm was about to come. Wei Yan casually placed the document on the desk and raised his voice. "Shin Lanshin, come here." Shin Lanshin quickly stood up and stood next to Wei Yan. She became even more nervous when she saw the fleeting look in her eyes. She subconsciously stood up straight, suppressed her smile, and asked cautiously, "Sister Yan, why are you looking at me like that?" Wei Yan said with a half smile, "Did you do anything wrong? I'm so sensitive just by looking at you." Shin Lanshin laughed awkwardly. "Sister Yang is really good at joking. I'm so honest, how could I do anything wrong?" Wei Yan's smile became less genuine. She casually pulled a few documents from the table and handed them to Shin Lanshin. "You will be responsible for the follow-up." Shin Lanshin picked up the document and took a look at it, frowning and saying, "Aren't these tasks originally the responsibility of Sumai and the others? Why, you have a problem with the job that Mr. Ling personally arranged." Wei Yan looked at her, his expression faded, and his momentum was a little sharp. "If you are not capable enough and can't handle it, just say it directly. There are many people who can do it." Wei Yan deliberately raised his voice a little. When the other people in the office heard the words "President Ling personally arranged," their expressions changed, and their eyes changed several times when they looked at Shin Lanshin. Shin Lanshin's head buzzed and her heart beat violently. She subconsciously looked up at Wei Yan and said with surprise, "This is specially arranged for me by President Ling. Boss Ling arranged it personally. Doesn't that mean Boss Ling intends to promote her?" Wei Yan snorted heavily with a straight face, which was considered as his agreement. Shin Lanshin couldn't help but smile. The news that Shin Lanshin was about to be promoted to chief secretary spread quietly in the office. Wei Yan criticized her several times for minor issues, but Shin Lanshin endured it, thinking that she would be promoted soon. When it was time to get off work, Wei Yan and the others had already left early, except Shin Lanshin, who still had a lot of things to do. Wei Yan and Sumai went downstairs together, with Sumai holding Wei Yan's arm. "Shin Lanshin is really going to be promoted to chief secretary," Wei Yan said calmly. "Why? Are you worried that you don't have a chance?" Sumai smiled and said, "I know you want to help me get promoted, but this matter still has to be decided by President Ling. However, you don't know that today they formed a small group and said behind Shin Lanshin's back that she must have slept with President Ling, so she was promoted so quickly." When Shin Lanshin asked them about their work today, several of them appeared to be enthusiastic, but they deliberately taught her to make mistakes behind her back. Wei Yan curled his lips. She had deeply experienced how terrible a woman's jealousy was after she followed Ling Yeting. Sumai saw that she was annoyed with Shin Lanshin, so she didn't say much and quickly waved goodbye and left. Wei Yang has been suffering from severe morning sickness recently and has no appetite, but she has to eat for the sake of the child. After get off work, she packed some food near the company and walked upstairs to the hotel where she was renting. Holding the packed lunchbox in one hand and replying to work messages on the phone in the other. Before she knew it, she had arrived at the elevator door of the hotel where she usually stayed. The elevator door slowly opened. Wei Yang looked up, the smile on his face disappeared instantly, and his face turned pale. There was already a man and a woman in the elevator. The man stood straight, his tie slightly untied, with a hint of impatience between his brows. The woman next to him was wearing luxurious clothes, a hat and sunglasses, so her face could not be seen clearly. But she tightly wrapped one hand around his arm, wishing she could stick her whole body to him. The man was none other than Ling Yeting, the man who had been harassing her not long ago. Chapter 27. Shall we take a shower together? Ling Yeting naturally also saw Wei Yan. The two looked at each other. Ling Yeting's expression was very cold, and there was no trace of the beastly look that had pressed her down on the bed and bullied her severely some time ago. Wei Yan felt embarrassed, as well as an inexplicable mixture of loss and anger. She unconsciously tightened the strap of the packing bag in her hand, hesitating whether she should go in. The woman who was holding Ling Yeting's arm saw Wei Yan staring at Ling Yeting in a daze, and she knew in her heart how outstanding his appearance was. She hugged Ling Yeting's arm possessively and said to Wei Yan, "Are you coming in or not? If not, I'll lock it up." Having said that, she raised her hand and pressed the close button. Enter. Wei Yan finally came to his senses and quickly got into the elevator. The woman hummed softly, "Which floor are you going to?" Wei Yan was just about to press the floor button when he discovered that they were going to the same floor. She said somewhat dryly, "On the same floor as you guys." When the woman heard this, her eyes flickered between Ling Yeting and Wei Yan. The elevator space is small, and it becomes more and more awkward once you enter it. As soon as the elevator door closed, Wei Yan felt a little regretful. The bright light on the elevator wall clearly reflected the embarrassment inside. She raised her head and looked straight ahead, meeting Ling Yeting's cold eyes. The corners of the man's lips curled up slightly, but Wei Yan pretended not to see him and quickly turned his eyes away, lowering his eyes to look at the ground. The elevator quickly and steadily stopped. Wei Yan didn't dare to look at the two people next to him and rushed out first. She took out the room card from her bag and opened the door. She tried hard not to look at the movements of Ling Yeting and the woman, but she caught a glimpse of the room Ling Yeting and the woman checked into was right next to hers. Wei Yan wanted to clench his fist, rushed into the room quickly, and slammed the door. Ling Yeting heard the noise and turned to look in the direction of Wei Yan's room. The woman beside him quickly opened the door and pulled him in, slamming the door shut, and said coquettishly with a sense of crisis, "Don't look at other women." Ling Yeting pulled his hand away indifferently. The woman was not angry. Instead, she took off her sunglasses and hat seductively and threw them aside, revealing her pretty face. It was the famous film actress Fang Miao. Fang Miao looked at Ling Yeting with a pair of watery eyes, then, "Wait for me. I'll go take a shower first." She took 2 steps towards the bathroom and looked at Ling Yeting again. "Or, shall we take a shower together?" Ling Yeting threw the documents and pen directly on the coffee table, and said in a cold and businesslike tone, "Okay, send the person over, sign the contract." The woman rolled her eyes immediately and said deliberately in a teasing tone while signing, "Boss Ling, I'm really curious, are you and your mistress so cold in bed?" Ling Yeting took the file and looked down at her, "You are very nosy." Wei Yang entered the room, closed the door, and stood there for several minutes before walking over to the sofa and sitting down. She took the food out of her hand and took a few bites numbly. Not only did it taste like chewing wax, but her eyes became red. With a sour taste in his nose, Wei Yang took 2 big gulps of wine, trying to stop his tears, but the grievance in his heart became more and more overwhelming. All I could see was the image of that woman leaning against Ling Yeting. Although I knew long ago that he would definitely be with another woman after breaking up with her. But they have been together for more than 4 years, and they have only been apart for less than 2 months, and Ling Yeting, that bastard, is already. I have lost all my appetite. She picked up the food and threw it into the trash can, then fell weakly on the sofa. All that kept replaying in her mind were scenes of her and Ling Yeting together. I don't know how long I lay there before there was a knock on the door. Wei Yang didn't move, but the person knocking on the door kept on knocking. She got up impatiently and walked behind the door. "Who?" The person outside the door said coldly, "Open the door." Wei Yang. Ling Yeting? If he wasn't rolling around in bed with his rich daughter, why was he getting in her way? Wei Yang rolled his eyes and turned to walk away. The person outside the door seemed to have guessed her thoughts and said slowly, "Not open. I'll ask the hotel staff to open it." Exclamation point. The anger value instantly reached its peak. She pulled the door open violently and looked at him coldly. "What can I do for you, Mr. Ling?" Ling Yeting stood at the door, looking down at her, with a righteous look on his face. "The family planning supplies in our room have been used up, bring the ones in your room to me."